Absolutely. Andrew, I'm Jerry. How are you doing? Nice to see you in person.
Hi, Andrew.
Good to see you too. Did you get the numbers you needed?
I did.
Good.
Thank
okay.
you.
Good.
Very
I thought
helpful.
they should. Somebody there should have them.
Yeah.
You look at that. Thank you. And I'll send you a card. I just need
I haven't met you.
You related to your brothers? Yes. Oh, yeah. I think I just wanted to get you in the press office.
Oh, that's good.
Still, you know, it's strange. When I was at the and all these issues come up. Here I am, 20 years later. Same issues. And the school. And you had them, and I had them, and everybody. Novel has them. I know. And of course,
Thank you.
took care of it. Made sure you got around and everything. Yeah, it was good. Very good. Good. Well, we're looking forward to it.
Stu, I don't think I've ever met. I'm Bruce Gelb.
Bruce, how are you? Good to see you.
I feel I know you. I've been reading your name for so many years, doing everything.
I feel the same about you.
Oh, you, same stuff. Same stuff. Stay.
But you know, Al, the one change from your time, and really I think from mine too, frankly.
I wonder if we should go down and say hello.
The portfolio has now broadened as the EU has become more of a geopolitical.
I have a little of that, but mostly.
On the Mount Himalaya.
And I do too. I began to have a little bit of it, but it's certainly expanded tremendously. But you're right, on the economic issues, you could just blink and say, I've been there before.
All my numbers are out there.
Some numbers between state and commerce. And so I know the rough numbers, but I said you.
Yeah, and it's just a question of which merger we're arguing about.
If you want
Going to Donald Douglas when I was there.
found it, which is good. It's always good when you give something out and you hope somebody can answer the question.
It is. Okay, thanks. I understand that Bowden Gray is going to be our successor. I think so. It hasn't been announced. But yeah.
Gray is going to be what, Stu?
We should start on time, actually.
That's not a very... Peter's not coming.
Oh, he's not coming.
Is Peter Watson not here?
I don't
know. He's not here yet.
Let's see.
Yes, Peter. Hi, Jerry Mitchell.
Hi, Peter. Vicky will be here. See you.
Henry. Thank you. I'm just going to go in the order that they're listed, but if
no, it's all right.
do you guys have a sequence that you like?
Yes, last if I can be. I always like to be last if I can.
All right. You want to go first, Virginia?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. And Henry. Most of you know that I am Bruce Gelb, the president of the Council of American Ambassadors, and I just want to welcome everyone here. This is the third forum for the Council, and it's probably as important at this time as anything that we've done in the Council, considering especially the fact that we had a luncheon speaker today, Senator Hagel, talking about the financial situation facing the United States, facing the Congress and the American people, with the very large deficit that we are running and the enormous competitive growth that's taking place in East and South Asia. The subject today is one that is very close to a subject that I have spent a lot of my time involved in, called public diplomacy. But what we're talking about today is commercial diplomacy, and that may sound a little strange or foreign to some of the people here, but the role of the ambassador, probably for the last 15 years anyway, has been focused very definitely on what he can do to be helpful to the American economy, to American business. The problem is that the American ambassador works within the aegis of the State Department, and very recently I saw a 20-page compendium prepared by Secretary Powell, who did a wonderful job of bringing the State Department's morale back to where it should be. Sad to say, the State Department has no national constituency. But if you go through that 18 to 20 pages, you will find a paragraph about 2 inches high that has to do with business and the economy. It has gotten lost within the State Department in a way that nobody in the State Department wants, nobody in the Congress wants, and certainly the American people don't want it to be lost, because we are a country where jobs basically are the thing that motivates everything that makes our system work. Today, for the first time, the Council of American Ambassadors is doing something with another major organization on a very specific track, the track being commercial diplomacy, the other organization being the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. We are very fortunate in being able to work together with this organization. They have their scholars and their practitioners deeply involved in virtually every aspect of what is taking place around the world. And at this point, the man who heads up the major project of science, technology, and the global economy for the Woodrow Wilson Center, Mr. Kent Hughes, who is the co-convener of this forum, is going to take you through the day that we're going to be having, and I'd like to turn it over to Kent Hughes.
Thank you, Bruce. I want to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Let me say just a word about the Wilson Center before we turn to today's program. As you may know, Wilson was the only president to earn a PhD, and he always thought in the course of his life that having lived both in the world of ideas and then in the world of action, that led to better policy and would lead to better research. And that's the ideal we try to follow here, and the ideal that the Congress had in mind when, instead of building one more statue or one more marble monument, they settled on a living memorial to Woodrow Wilson. And let me say some quick thanks, too, both to Ambassador Gelb and to Ambassador Charles Cobb, who were not only conveners today, but were very active in helping shape today's program. And I do want to remind the Council of American Ambassadors what a treasure you have in Carolyn Gretzinger. I have done a lot of joint ventures, and I have yet to work with someone more effective, more organized, or more pleasant to deal with. And putting these together, as you probably remember from your own lives, can be complicated. Well, today you have in front of you the program. We're going to cover two different aspects of commercial diplomacy. The first, the more traditional, perhaps more familiar advocacy of U.S. commercial interests overseas, and the second, looking at the broadening role of the ambassador in linking commercial diplomacy and economic diplomacy to broader national security and foreign policy goals. In each panel, after the panel discussion, we'll have a commentary and then questions and answers. We are hoping to come out of today with some specific, actionable, doable recommendations from each of the panels. We'd love to have a collection of 10 or a dozen items that we could take both to the Congress and to the administration in terms of how to strengthen the ambassador's hand in playing these two very different roles. We are fortunate to have a very fine rapporteur who's sitting right down here in the front, who will provide us a useful summary and capture those suggestions. Let me just briefly introduce our moderator, and we have much more, a bit lengthier record of all the distinguished people on the program today. Stu Eisenstadt, I am just a pleasure to have him back at the Wilson Center, where he not only is a good friend of the center, but was here as a public policy scholar after his service in the Clinton administration, where in 6 months he wrote a very fine and very widely reviewed and praised book. Stu, as you may know, has a very distinguished background. He was the domestic policy advisor for President Carter in the Clinton administration. He was Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. He was the Undersecretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs and the Undersecretary for Trade in the Commerce Department, and before that, the Ambassador to the European Union. It's hard to think of someone who hasn't covered more of the right bases at the same time. And before I turn the program over to him, if you want to do a little homework on commercial diplomacy, there's no better place to start than this marvelous volume produced by the Business Council for International Understanding. It is clear, has broad principles that are useful, and a number of case studies that help you wrestle with more difficult situations. Well, thank you again for coming, and let me turn it over to you, Stu.
Thank you very much, Kent. Indeed, I do feel very much at home here. My office was just a few doors down, and before that, even before you came to the Wilson Center during the Carter and Reagan administrations, I was on the board of directors of the Wilson Center when it was still at the Castle Building. I want to thank Bruce for his terrific leadership of the organization, the Council of American Advisors, and Joe Gildenhorn, my very dear friend, who's chairman of the Wilson Center and also a member of the Council of American Ambassadors. This is a time of really great challenge to U.S. ambassadors abroad, because in addition to the traditional political and diplomatic responsibilities, increasingly foreign policy is being defined by commercial policy. When one considers how radical a step that is, it used to be thought that diplomats and ambassadors would not stoop to deal with commercial issues, that somehow was beneath their dignity. Now it is in an integrated global economy, part and parcel of their daily work. By commercial diplomacy, we mean the official U.S. government's support for U.S. companies and business interests in the host country to help them with trade and investment disputes with our host government, and in more general terms, to facilitate their capacity to do business in the home country, creating profits and ultimately jobs not only in that country but at home as well for the parent company. I have another connection to this beside being ambassador to the EU, which, as Al Kingon and I were saying, my distinguished predecessor as ambassador to the EU, is, or at least was, distinctly a commercial job. And that is, when I was President Carter's chief domestic advisor, one of the reorganizations of government we did was to take the commercial service out of the State Department and put it in the Commerce Department on the theory, which would today be almost laughable given where things are, that state was simply not interested and never would be in commercial issues. That's, I think, a thing of the past, but we did that, and there you are. When I was ambassador to the EU, myself, but all American ambassadors were given a charge by Secretary Christopher and President Clinton, and that is that our performance would be significantly measured by how accessible we were to U.S. business and how interested and effective we were in commercial diplomacy. My own experience in the EU, which, as Al and I were saying, you could almost substitute the companies and the issues are the same, was dealing with things like EU standards that kept U.S. products out of the European Union, lobbying what we affectionately call DG Competition, the Competition Bureau, on things like the Boeing-McDonnell Douglas merger, working with the U.S. aluminum industry to try to get the EU to approve a restructuring of the industry, working on the European Union-Turkey Customs Union with the European Commission and Parliament, working with the EU Committee of the AmCham, and with European business interests like UNICE as well. An ambassador today must be both a forceful advocate for U.S. business, but also must balance a number of interests. And I hope that our panel, both here and in the second session, will deal with some of these. For example, one problem that is very delicate and frankly has tripped up some ambassadors very severely is the problem of favoring one U.S. company over another in a particular trade dispute with the host country. This itself raises broader questions of where to draw a proper line between advocating for the private sector and taking into account broader diplomatic concerns. Second, something I think all of us have had to contend with, and that is a particular challenge for ambassadors today, is the coordination of commercial policy in an embassy. Most embassies have representatives from multiple departments, not only state, our home department, but Treasury, Commerce, USTR. And if your experience was anything like mine, the officials from those agencies often had their own reporting channels, as you would expect, to their home agencies. And it's a real burden for the ambassador to make sure he's not the last or she's not the last to learn of what those particular officers are being instructed by their home agencies to do. So being a coordinator means coordinating them in the home base, but also trying to make sure that the agencies at home are sensitive to the role of the ambassador, who has to coordinate these all as well. And then there are some smaller but still important embassies in which there is no commercial officer, and the State Department economic officer has to be both the commercial officer and the economic officer, imposing additional responsibilities and burdens with respect to dealing with the commerce-state relationship. One other set of points, and then I'll introduce our panel. It's been my experience, and I think the only perhaps unhappy experience I've had at the State Department, which I dearly love both in the building and in Brussels, and that is I found, to my chagrin, and I think it's still a problem, that the economic track at State is not the fastest track to an ambassadorship for a career person. And it takes a very talented and sometimes courageous person like an Al Larson to decide that they're going to make their career on the economic side of that building and still reach the very pinnacle of the ambassadorial corps. Even more frustrating, because I also spent 14 months at the Commerce Department, is that up to the time I was in the administration, there were 0 commercial officers who had ever been appointed an ambassador. We now have 2, the first during the Clinton administration. So that's also not an effective track. Having moved the commercial service from state to commerce, it also has made it more difficult for very talented commercial officers in the Foreign Commercial Service, Jerry, to make their way up to the top of the ambassadorial corps, even though commercial diplomacy is so much more important than it was some years ago. So, to conclude, we have, I think, a very talented and interesting panel. They're going to look at the challenges that an ambassador faces in coordinating the many agencies represented in an embassy so they can work together to contribute to effective commercial diplomacy. They're going to talk about the steps that can be taken by the administration, Congress, state, and the Commerce Departments and others to increase the effectiveness of U.S. commercial diplomacy. We have 3 panelists, and I'll introduce each in the order in which they will speak. Jerry Mitchell, the former Deputy Director General of the Commercial Service and someone with whom I had the pleasure of working, will be our first speaker. Vicki Weil, senior advisor to the Business Council for International Understanding, which Kent just mentioned had done this major study, and Vicki has given a great deal of thought and good work over the years to this whole set of issues. And then Peter Watson, the former president and CEO of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, on whose board I used to sit when I was at State and Treasury. And with no further ado, I'd like to have Jerry start.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stu, very much. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks to Bruce Gelb, whom I served with in Brussels at the U.S. Embassy in Belgium. I also had the pleasure to work closely with Vicki Wheel at the BCIU and a number of her colleagues, and also with Peter Watson when we were looking at the OPIC agreement with Mexico about a year and a half ago, I guess, although we've looked at it for decades with Mexico unsuccessfully until recently. So it's a real pleasure to be here and talk about a topic that I think has evolved over the last couple of decades since the creation of the commercial service. I also want to thank Stu, since in creating the commercial service, I was one of the 39 officers that eventually moved over from State to the Commerce Department and joined the commercial service with the assumption that, again, the State Department simply didn't recognize the value of commercial work, and hopefully the Commerce Department would. That, fortunately, as Stu has mentioned, has changed a great deal over the years, and all to the better, and I'm glad to see that. But at the time, it seemed like a good move for myself, and I think it probably was over the years, and helped U.S. business, particularly in the 80s and early 90s, to really find very strong support from the U.S. government and certain agencies, and to stimulate the State Department also to task its ambassadors to also look at commercial diplomacy as an important aspect of U.S. foreign policy. My view of commercial diplomacy has really been shaped in large part by recent experiences in both Korea and in Mexico, where commercial diplomacy is unavoidably near the top of our list of major priorities in foreign policy in both of those countries. And looking at commercial diplomacy as more than simply advocating on behalf of U.S. companies, and looking at commercial policy as really advancing, working with business and government to advance our objectives, economic interests overseas, if you will, in a more coordinated manner, recognizing that much of our leadership in foreign policy derives from our strength economically and commercially, but also recognizing that we have to convince our trading partners and our commercial partners that it's in their interest to work with us in advancing global commercial interests, if you will. And I think that's a changing evolution that we are increasingly recognizing in our embassies overseas, recognizing in Washington as well, and hopefully recognizing with our trading partners. I think that means that commercial diplomacy really divides into three areas. First, it is advancing our commercial interest, absolutely. But in addition to that, ambassadors are charged with advancing the liberalization of global trade, the global trading environment. And as we look at the stalled Doha rounds in the next set of trade negotiations, ambassadors play a critical role in somehow communicating with Washington, host country concerns over liberalizing the trading environment and providing strategies on how to deal with that, those impasses that exist now, for example, in agriculture and in services in the Doha round. And then I would add a third area that I think Peter is most familiar with, and that I saw work particularly well in Mexico, and I'm sure in other countries it has worked as well, and that is economic development. A recognition that you can't advance U.S. commercial interests, you can't stimulate liberalization of global trade if you don't realize that you have to help your trading partners develop economically, that you have to show them the benefits of a more open global trading system, and that liberalizing services, that liberalizing agriculture will have short-term pain for long-term gain. But in order to do that, we have to go beyond the rhetoric, and we really have to develop an economic development strategy that joins with our commercial diplomacy that convinces countries that it's in their interest to join with us in liberalizing the global environment. That transparency, that corporate governance, that rule of law, that protection of intellectual property are all as important for their businesses as it is for our businesses. And in doing so, we develop a vision for commercial diplomacy that I think probably we really haven't fully developed back in Washington among all the agencies. There certainly are individuals, there certainly are agencies, there certainly are countries in which we've done a fairly good job in defining commercial diplomacy and broadening it to include those three aspects, but I think as a government we still probably have not articulated that vision that has really drawn in business support and really drawn in the support from Congress that we need if we're going to advance the role of commercial diplomacy. The challenges that ambassadors face, Stu has touched on a few of them, but in Mexico we have 38 federal agencies. Probably since I left in October, we have 3 or 4 more in the embassy. Coordinating those agencies, many of which are involved in commercial diplomacy, is a real challenge. Not only because they report to different authorities, but because those authorities in Washington sometimes give conflicting guidance to the people in the field. What I found, and I think Chuck Ford would probably agree, my colleague who's worked long and many years in the same area, is that coordination at the post, while a challenge, is not nearly the challenge as coordination in Washington. And it is extremely difficult to find the same kind of camaraderie and willingness to follow one guide who is the ambassador overseas, and in Washington there is no one guide unless we look at the president, and in commercial diplomacy from time to time the president engages, but by and large that's not at that level, and perhaps it should be, and maybe that's one of our things that we really want to talk about today. What I think ambassadors have done in the past, and I've seen work very successfully, is give a major role to the deputy chief of mission in coordinating commercial diplomacy among the agencies at post. Not that the ambassador abdicates that responsibility, but in the day-to-day work where an ambassador not only has certain ceremonial and protocol aspects, but many other issues coming before him or her, that the DCM can really become a stimulating force for drawing together all the different agencies and insisting that at post they coordinate. And I've seen this work in a weekly meeting of the relevant agencies. But what we've done and what we did in both Korea and Mexico is we included the political section. We included the public diplomacy section. Of course, we included USAID. We included traditional agencies of state and treasury and commerce. We included the Environmental Protection Agency. We included the science and technology people. Of course, the agriculture people in the Foreign Agricultural Service. So that we all knew what each other was doing, and as we coordinated a vision set forward by the ambassador in what they wanted to see our policy be with Mexico or with Korea, we were able to coordinate across the agencies. They in turn, both those members of the country team and I believe the ambassador today, have an obligation to coordinate back to Washington with a common vision. And sometimes that is a real challenge, as those here in the room who have served as ambassador know. Sometimes Washington isn't interested. Sometimes they don't want to hear your particular views on a vision. They'll set the vision, you execute. But in fact, I think that a role of an ambassador today is really to continue to help set that vision with Washington agencies and help them draw together, first by drawing together at post, and then by working with the agencies that they represent back through Washington in a coordinated vision. Washington seldom puts out a vision for dealing with a country like Mexico. We have a program in Mexico that Peter's most familiar with called Partnership for Prosperity, which was designed to spread the benefits of NAFTA to more people in Mexico and stem migration into the United States at the same time. While Washington, in working with the Post, came up with that policy, and the two presidents, Presidents Fox and Bush, met and articulated the beginnings of that policy, it really was left to the agencies in Washington and to the people at Post to provide that vision. And I think working in both directions, we were able to do that, but we pushed that vision forward from the post. The ambassadors pushed that forward, 2 different ambassadors, Jeff Davidal and Tony Garza, and likewise, we had people in Washington like Peter, people at Thelma Askey at TDA and others that also helped articulate that vision. So part of the challenge of the ambassador is not only coordinating at post, but coordinating the Washington agencies, putting forward the view that you can have a coordinated vision of what commercial diplomacy should be like at post, and then articulate it both at the macro level in negotiations, in liberalization, and at the micro level by using all the tools that are available. There are a huge number of tools available for an ambassador in commercial diplomacy if we can draw them together for advancing whatever relationship we have with a particular country, whether it's the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, Trade Development Agency, the Small Business Administration, the Export-Import Bank, USAID. And when we put those agencies together, and the resources together, the influence they can have on our commercial diplomacy and on our foreign policy with a particular country is extremely impressive to witness. And I saw that in Mexico, a little lesser extent in Korea, but in Mexico it has an amazing impact on our commercial diplomacy and on our foreign policy. I'd also like to suggest that funding levels across our agencies is a real challenge for an ambassador. There are certain agencies that are extremely well funded year after year. Increasingly, those are not any of the agencies, unfortunately, concerned with commercial diplomacy. They're the agencies concerned with security. One of the challenges of an ambassador, I think, and we'll probably deal with this more in the second panel, is how do you harness commercial diplomacy to the overriding security concerns that we are faced with overseas in articulating U.S. foreign policy today. And frankly, security and commercial diplomacy are not unrelated at all. And one of the aspects that I can think of that comes most quickly to mind with Mexico was a series of seminars and programs and funding that we put forward on securing the supply chain. Because if you secure the supply chain of goods entering the United States, you enhance the security of the United States, but at the same time you facilitate the flow of goods back and forth between trading partners. So harnessing, if you will, commercial diplomacy to the major priority today, probably, of foreign policy, that of security of the United States, is one aspect that the ambassador can promote, can draw together, can show the importance of security and commercial diplomacy. U.S. Customs, now part of DHS, or Customs and Border Protection, has a great deal to do with commercial diplomacy. And we had them serve on our interagency post committee on commercial diplomacy, because without customs support, we were not able to advance much of our commercial agenda in Mexico. We have to secure the trade if we're going to advance our commercial diplomacy and liberalize in some of those areas. Let me mention a couple of other challenges that I see developing. One of the challenges I think an ambassador faces in trying to articulate legitimate concerns of the host country is not being perceived as an apologist for the country that they represent. And I know that's very difficult to do because Washington doesn't care about the complaints, particularly of a Mexico or a Korea or a Belgium, about our commercial policy. But in fact, it seems to me that it's very important that we articulate back to Washington legitimate concerns that the host country has with our commercial diplomacy toward them. This is not a one-way street, and approaching commercial diplomacy as though we're only right and the trading partner is wrong doesn't get us very far. And I've seen some egregious cases, for example, in Mexico dealing with cement or tuna or steel, where for 15 years we have not yielded, have not really worked to satisfy Mexican concerns over our commercial diplomacy, and yet we want that kind of cooperation from Mexico and everything that we put forward. So it seems to me that one of the roles of the ambassador, and one of the most difficult roles, is trying to articulate some of those concerns, legitimate concerns of our trading partners, back to Washington, trying to deal with some of those concerns so that they're more receptive to our objectives of liberalization, of increasing the flow of goods and services, of removing barriers, of reducing corruption, of having more transparency. And that is a real challenge, and one that's not easily overcome by ambassadors. Let me stop there, and I think we'll
thank you
have a
very much.
discussion.
Very much appreciate excellent presentation, Vicki.
Thank you, Stu. First of all, I want to thank the Council for inviting BCIU to participate today. And I'd also like to say that I see in this room just lots and lots of BCIU friends and colleagues with whom we've worked, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. The gentleman who just moved across the row in the back, Ambassador Bruce Langen, is the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy, which is the career counterpart to the Council. And I want to just add to the fact that BCIU was not the sole sponsor of the book that is on sale out on the table, but the Academy was also the sponsor. And in fact, they brought the idea to us. So it's a pleasure for us to work with the two complementary organizations who care about commercial diplomacy. Many of you in the room who are members of the Council have come through our briefing program. Almost all of you were in the ambassadorial seminar where we came in and presented our views on commercial diplomacy. You probably remember this little checklist that we published to give to you that laid out all of your powers and your capabilities as ambassadors, your convening power, your advocacy, your intelligence, your market access knowledge, your knowledge of the local host country market. Those are all givens, and those are things with which you all, those were tools with which you all had to work. Our organization, BCIU, has been very, very closely monitoring the practice of commercial diplomacy. The reason being there's no other organization doing it. We fashion ourselves as the ombudsman. We champion it. We are very sensitive to its successes. When I came to Washington, I was in the private sector, and I came into BCIU in 1997. And at that point, Acting Secretary Eagleberger and then Secretary Eagleberger called upon our organization to come in to talk to him about how we could better promote U.S. companies around the world. This was shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, and we were being charged to try to help the State Department become more sensitive to business. And of course, this is after the State Department had let the commercial service go over to the Commerce Department. So our charge at that point was to try to help the Foreign Service officers understand how better to level the playing field for American companies, how to make them more competitive. This was in an era when I would say American companies still had quite a bit of competitive advantage and comparative advantage. And to that end, BCIU began a training program which still is flourishing in the State Department and in the Foreign Service Institute in Brandon Grove. Ambassador Brandon Grove, who's sitting in the back, was the head of the Foreign Service Institute at the time that we began to work with state on training. And that, again, was not just to teach, but to sensitize officers as to what their powers were and their responsibilities were to help with commercial diplomacy. And that initiative is still quite active. Today, I would say commercial diplomacy is taking a very different, it's segueing into a much more challenging practice simply because the world is changing. I mean, we all read Tom Friedman about the globalization of everything in the world. You see what happens when the world becomes flat, and you suddenly realize that our national interest is very murky, or rather it's melded within the national interest of other companies and other countries, other countries' companies, I should say. This presents a challenge for us, and all of you have come to us frequently and asked, what is a U.S. company, what are U.S. national interests, what are U.S. corporate interests? And the guidelines that the Commerce Department published around the time that I came to BCIU have been altered, and they've been altered because what the national interest is today is not the same as then, and we can't necessarily always insist on a 50% content rule in order to provide advocacy, because sometimes it's in the national interest to make an exception if you have a technological exchange or more follow-on business, and there's a list of reasons. Now, that create exceptions to our advocacy guidelines, which really were the beginning of our commercial diplomacy major initiative. We believe that commercial diplomacy probably ranks as high as any other foreign policy initiative, in that the economy of the United States is dependent upon our successes. And we do bring, as Jerry said, other types of policies and strengths to other countries by bringing in our commercial values and practices. 4 years ago, we published an advocacy report which called upon the administration to make significant changes in the way we support U.S. companies. Today, we are working on another report, but it's going to be much shorter. And it's going to be much shorter because instead of being critical or making suggestions, we are calling upon the administration to work with us and our members. And I would like to also take the opportunity to say that I chair a commercial diplomacy task force of about 5 or 6 major companies, and I see several of their representatives in the room here today, and I'm very happy to have them with us. These are companies that are very, very sensitive to the efforts and the successes of ambassadors and their leadership of embassies. And we are going to write a second report, but this one's going to be very brief, and it will probably simply call for the administration to elevate the practice of commercial diplomacy and the coordination above the level that it has been, such that the White House and Congress is more aware of what our needs are. This is sort of in response to the fact that the Trade Promotion Coordinating Committee, which you probably know of, is an organ of about 19 government agencies that sits in the Commerce Department, is chaired by the Secretary of Commerce, but it includes state and all of the other agencies that practice foreign policy, has been a very good organization for coordination, has been a very good organization for preventing duplication of efforts within the government, but has never really had the teeth to make certain that the practice of commercial diplomacy has been elevated. We do know that there is a lot of coordination at the embassy level, not so much in Washington, and we applaud the ambassadors who do that. The State Department actually had a directive a few years ago that the DCM coordinate a strategic commercial plan, which would be put together by the country team, the leaders of all of the different sections of the embassy. And for a while that was very good. We believe that probably needs to be continued with a little more force, a lot more force. You all know that the ambassador has the kind of knowledge and convening power and access, but I think that the coordination of the agencies at post, given that we can't coordinate them so well in Washington, is going to be very important. And to that end, I don't know how many of you know that there has been recently on March 15th a cable that went out from Secretary Rice and Secretary Gutierrez from the Commerce Department calling for ambassadors and principal officers to become personally involved in ensuring that we are committed to commercial interests as a priority, and that the entire mission be involved, that they report their best practices back to Washington and among the agencies and the embassies and share them. There is going to be a working group to coordinate between commerce and state. We do hope that it will be elevated so that it will be very effective. They will have responsibility over not just programs and decision making, but also policy. And they will be looking at resources, which is of course a big deficiency right now in the field, and also on programs. Our members really have a sense that the competing interests right now of our foreign policy have challenged commercial diplomacy, and it's not that the officers and the ambassadors aren't doing a magnificent job. It's just that we have other calls on their time, and therefore resources are a critical priority, and resources in our parlance are people. So you will see out on the table an ad that we placed in roll call this last month, calling for more money for certain agencies that are in embassies and which are critical to ambassadors being able to coordinate the role they have as the the leading commercial officer in their host country.
That's great. Anything more? Terrific. Thank you, Vic. We'll conclude the initial presentations by having Peter Watson, again, the former president and CEO of OPIC. Peter?
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And I just would appreciate also the opportunity of being here today. This is an extraordinarily important subject. It's very difficult for the reasons, frankly, that Virginia mentioned, to differentiate between commercial interests and those, frankly, that serve national security and foreign policy goals. They're increasingly integrated, as has been noted. But let me just say, I follow with great interest the leadership of Ambassador Eisenstadt and his many roles, and it really does bring into sharp focus the several drivers that I think are absolutely crucial to bring together successful prosecution of U.S. economic interests abroad. Let me just say that I think in the absence of there being, well, let me put it more positively. Any incoming administration has got a very limited amount of time to set priorities and to set strategic goals. And if they do not do that, then one of two things happens. Either there isn't a focus on prosecution of policy towards supporting commercial interests, or what happens is it's left to the individual ambassadors and their staff to make these things a priority, or what happens is they're left to the members of the administration working in conjunction with interested people within the Congress to make these issues a priority. And I have seen, frankly, both situations in practice, which is to say, at the beginning of this administration, it was a focus of the administration to ensure that OPIC, my agency, focused on those countries and those companies that would otherwise not get support. And that was a very strong direction to us. As Jerry indicated, it led OPIC to achieve something that it hadn't been able to do in its 32-year history, and that was to conclude a bilateral agreement with one of our most important strategic, political, economic partners, which is to say Mexico. And believe it or not, within 6 months of concluding that agreement with Mexico, it's resulted in $60 million worth of investment going into Mexico. Of greater importance, perhaps you might say, is the focus that we've seen on sub-Saharan Africa. When we assumed stewardship of the administration, one of my colleagues is here today who's worked with me on this, we have gone from a very meager amount of investment in sub-Saharan Africa, $85 million, to the point today that we're at $1.9 billion. And that's just not in, it's not large infrastructure projects, it's in housing, it's in HIV/AIDS mortgage, it's in water programs in villages. And these things have come about because there has been a focus both from the administration, but I also have to say that in no small part this is a function of how strongly committed the missions are, the ambassadors and their staff are, to in fact achieving these goals and objectives. In many instances, there is not a great deal of focused support coming from Washington. On the contrary, as we've seen, there's been, in fact, a lack of prioritization of economic policy or commercial interests as, in fact, one of the elements of the success of different missions. And perhaps it's time to look at the question of whether or not we want to have a set of metrics of actual sort of measured outcomes as a way of determining the annual reporting of ambassadors and their staff. I'm not sure to what extent it's been incorporated into the review and merit analysis of ambassadors and their staff, but there's a lot to be said for looking at objective criteria metrics, of outcomes to determine how successful commercial diplomacy has been implemented. The lack of coordination within the various agencies, in fact, sometimes has been profound. It has been good at a certain level, and I agree that the Trade Promotion Coordinating Committee has been a mechanism to try and bring together agencies. And by the way, I think Senator Sarbanes has to be credited with leadership of this. But within Congress, there hasn't been, in fact, a significant, I think, priority on ensuring that there is coordination within these agencies. In no small part, it's because, well, no surprise here, there are different agencies of jurisdiction within the Hill. There's the Banking Committee. There is the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. All have different jurisdiction over different committees. The Trade Promotion Coordinating Committee is the one instance in which all of the agencies, economic agencies, are brought together to testify once a year. But this, in fact, I think should be enhanced. It should be increased because while Ex-Im Bank, TDA, and the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service do a fine job at times, I have to tell you, and others, we don't see the type of coordination that I think should be optimal. And in one case, there is a couple of government agency programs, this won't surprise you, that are in competition with each other, and therefore they actively run interference in the other's prosecution of their programs because they interfere with the parochial interests of the other. I might be pressed later to say what they are, but for purposes of this program, I'll just tell you that they've led to active disincentive to the prosecution of our interests. The challenge that was mentioned earlier, and Laura Tyson, I think, might have identified this first, the question of who is us, has in fact complicated the question of U.S. Commercial diplomacy. Siemens today has more employees in the United States and more gross profits than anywhere else in the world. And of course, it took over Westinghouse. Daimler Chrysler is obviously a very significant organization that supports U.S. corporations, and so it is important that we devolve and to help broaden our rules of how we support U.S. companies that have been invested in by foreign companies. This, up to this point, has been a very difficult question for Congress and the administration, frankly, to get their arms around. Is Siemens a German company? Of course. Is Siemens an American company? Well, any company that has its largest employees and its largest profits, largest taxpayer base, has to obviously be considered to be an American company. So there are some very difficult questions that you have to deal with and get your arms around. And OPEC right now is prevented from supporting those companies, and our attempt to get similar rules that the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service has adopted was in fact denied to us during our most recent reauthorization because of the support from companies and unions that in fact opposed this, even though those same unions within Westinghouse and Chrysler lost jobs because of their unwillingness to support OPEC's programs abroad. So there's some very narrow and parochial interests that still remain here that we need to deal with. On balance, though, what is clear is that there is an increased intersection between economic, political, and development objectives of the United States. And I have to give very real credit to the United States, to people like Ambassador Eisenstadt, to people like Bob Zalek, who have understood the critical intersection of these three sets of disciplines. And perhaps we can spend some time going into those in our second panel, because the prosecution of our national security and foreign policy goals are intimately knitted together with the ability to prosecute not just U.S. economic interest, but have been identified before other foreign practices and their various disciplines. Because as we in fact integrate better practices through the WTO, through international organizations, world economic welfare improves, and the disciplines improve internationally. So there is a knock-on effect that, in fact, has significant compounded economic welfare gains right throughout not just throughout the United States, but in fact throughout the world. So I might just say that I'll stop there, perhaps, Ambassador, but I would say that there's a lot of room for improvement, both at the congressional level, putting additional strength on the TPCC. I do believe that there is increased need to ensure that the efforts of ambassadors and their staff are recognized, and perhaps one way of doing that is to have a set of metrics and deliverables to ensure that that's being able to incorporate it into their performance evaluations. Thank you.
Peter, thank you very much. I think all three of the panelists gave us a very good overview. May I suggest, I think that Carl Spielvogel, who is the former U.S. ambassador to the Slovak Republic, is going to make some comments based on the presentations, and then we'll take your questions and comments.
Thank you. Let me give you a view from the battlefield. I received a phone call in 1998 from Madeleine Albright saying, would you be interested in becoming the ambassador to the Slovak Republic? This is the same Madeleine Albright who I thought was my friend. She had called Slovakia the black hole in the heart of Europe. However, she said, you come out of the business world, and what they need is a little help in the business area. A little help would be, to put it gently. They were in deep trouble. The koruna was falling in value. Interest rates were hovering near 30%. And the country was low on cash, and unemployment was about 30%. Yet very recently you saw our president being greeted there by a very happy group of people who have embraced their new prosperity, and I'm pleased to say that the United States played a very important role in that. There was a very large steel mill in Košice, the second largest city of the Slovak Republic, on the border closest to the Ukraine. As you know, Bratislava is at the other end of the country, 35 kilometers away from Vienna. This was a steel mill that had 17,000 employees and was an example of the worst kind of crony capitalism imaginable. They had literally bankrupted the company, and it was going out of business. Long story short, the United States Commerce Ambassador intervened, and without telling you more than you need to know, because we don't have time, we got U.S. Steel interested in buying the steel mill. And on a given day, Prime Minister Dzurinda, the very charismatic Prime Minister of Slovakia, and President Bill Clinton were on the telephone discussing how important this deal was for U.S. Steel to buy. If you look at the figures today, Slovakia is the largest manufacturer of automobiles in the part of Central Europe and probably in all of Europe. U.S. Steel, probably it's the best investment they ever made. And in addition to taking over the plant, they have built an industrial park that has attracted all sorts of other business. The point of my story being, I guess the best advice I received in ambassador school was someone said to me quietly one night over a drink, this was from a very experienced ambassador, if you want to do something, send them an email and say, if I don't hear from you in 24 hours, I'm going to do the following. Because you'll never hear from them and you'll be able to get things done. I had none of the problems, Stu, that the panel alluded to, because this was a small embassy. I had a wonderful econ officer. My commerce officer was in Vienna. I had to share him with Slovakia. But I had a terrific econ officer who had been a journalist in Akron, came to Slovakia, learned the language. And if there was one recommendation that I would like to make, It's okay to bring the ambassadors back after 3 years, but leave the econ officer there for 5 years. He had learned the language. He knew all of the business people. He could take me everywhere. And just as we were getting ready to go to work, he said, "Mr. Ambassador, I'm getting ready for my next assignment." My point being that in Slovakia, it wasn't a question of what the ambassador should do. It's what he had to do. The other thing that I did was I invited as many friends of mine who were businessmen to come. And I said, "I will give you housing at our modest residence, but you're going to have to sing for your supper." And we put together panel discussions. I brought together a fellow who was very big in shopping centers. I brought a couple of investment bankers. I brought publishers. And what we would do is serve a Diet Coke or something at the embassy and bring together 40 people from the community to talk about the economy and how you become a thriving place. I'm pleased to say that today, Slovakia, as you know, is doing extremely well. The koruna, this really hurts. When I got there, the koruna was trading 51 to the dollar. It's now trading about 28 to the dollar. And one of the interesting things, Stuart, that I think we all ought to talk about in terms of advice to places around the world is the experience that they're having in some of these emerging nations with the flat tax. I am not a great supporter of Mr. Forbes, but at least in that part of the world, Slovakia has a flat tax right now of 17% on everything. Estonia has a flat tax of 26%. Serbia has a flat tax of 14%. The Ukraine has a flat tax of 13%. The flat tax seems to be working in that part of the world. And one of the great contributions, of course, that we always made, and it's the contrast between the Czech Republic and Slovakia. The Czech Republic is still suffering the aftermath of crony capitalism in their banks. We, with the help of Bob Rubin, got a few very good treasury people in. We helped the Slovaks roll up their bad debt, get rid of the bad debt, and privatize the banks. And I'm very proud of the role that the United States has played in Slovakia.
Carl, thank you very much. It's a great success story. Questions, comments? Could you identify yourself as well? Thank you. Could each person identify themselves? Yes, ma'am. We have mics.
Hi, my name is Marjorie Chorlins, and I represent one of what Peter referred to as those narrow parochial interests, which is Motorola. Just a couple of comments, really. First of all, thanks to all of the panelists for wonderful presentations, and also to the organizations who are sponsoring today for pulling this together. One observation, I think if you asked any company representative who has had cause to work with an embassy or with Commerce or State on commercial advocacy, you would find at best a mixed bag in terms of experience. Our experiences do vary embassy by embassy. And I don't necessarily agree with what I think I heard some of the panelists suggest, that that the importance of commercial advocacy is really fully understood, especially within the State Department. I do acknowledge that joint memo that went out a couple of weeks ago from Secretaries Rice and Gutierrez, but the plain fact is, if you look, for example, at the amount of time that is spent training officers who are going out to posts, regardless of their level, whether econ, commercials, DCMs, or ambassadors, you will find that the amount of time they spend during their training on commercial advocacy is diminished substantially. Now, if there isn't a more telling example of a trend in the wrong direction, I'm really not sure there is another one. The only other point I'd like to make is that I think Peter put his finger on it, that it is the Congress that in particular needs educating. about the value of commercial diplomacy. It is a complicated world today. In fact, Siemens currently employs more people in the United States than Motorola does. But I have to tell you, I would be a little bit reluctant to see Siemens gain access to some of the resources that Motorola has, because we are not in turn able to avail ourselves of the German resources that Siemens has available to it. So I think what we have in this situation is a philosophy that guides the relationship between business and government here in this country that is not necessarily consistent with that which guides most of our main competing countries around the world. And I think the Congress needs substantial education in this regard. And I would simply urge that everybody who is in a position to do something about that, the organizations in particular represented here today, take this on as a serious initiative because it is not getting better. Thank you.
I think it's an important set of questions, and I'd like the panelists to feel free to dive in with them. Vicki, one statement that seems to be right up your alley is the question of whether professional diplomats are actually getting less training than before on commercial diplomacy, and even if they're not, are they getting an adequate amount?
Thank you, Stu. As a proportion, as a percentage of overall training, I would probably say yes, they're getting less. Because of some of the emphasis now on security, on really security. One example that I can give you is that we have run a program for the last year and a half on trying to help companies expedite and improve the process of bringing in temporary personnel on visas from around the world for assignments, for trade fairs, for customers as well as employees. And we have tried unsuccessfully to bring the business community into the consular section training. And again, just as I said for ambassadors and DCMs and econ officers, this isn't so much to teach as it is to sensitize, to help them connect the dots between the importance of bringing these people in and the possibility of the potential for lost revenues for companies or lost employees. That's just one example and one aspect of our training. But I would say in every class that we've been invited to go into, we've made an effort to be there as much as possible, and in fact have tried to enlarge our time in each class. A good example is the ambassadorial seminar, where we tried to increase it from an hour of a business presentation to 2 hours. I guess I'm similar with the DCM course. The business portion of the DCM course has been reduced by 50%. So, yes.
Interesting. Perhaps the other part, Peter and Jerry, which was this question of what is an American company or what qualifies one for commercial advocacy. The questioner asked from a Motorola perspective that yes, Siemens does have more employees perhaps, or as many if not more, most American companies, but those American companies can't avail themselves of the other countries' assets. Would you want to respond, Peter and Jerry, to that?
Do you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Stu. That is a real challenge. It's been a challenge for a certain number of years, but it's more challenging today. I remember when we were in Korea negotiating on the auto market opening, we had the big three, and all of a sudden in the middle of the negotiations we had only the big two, because the American Automobile Association, or U.S. Automotive Association, Andrew Card was the head of, Daimler Chrysler was no longer part of that because they had purchased Chrysler. It didn't mean that Daimler Chrysler wasn't producing U.S. automobiles, and it seemed to me a very funny approach to it, but still politically I understood what was happening, but from a commercial point of view it made it very difficult to advocate only on behalf of two and not three, and the Koreans would ask that question on a regular basis. In fact, they would use it to their advantage in the negotiation. We looked at about 3 years ago, when I was back in Washington, we revisited the definition of a U.S. company. And we spent about 6 months, I think, looking both with state and other agencies that were involved and within the Commerce Department. And in the end, we left the definition flexible, and virtually the same as we'd started with it. And the reason was because every time we tried to start defining more clearly what a U.S. company was, we got into trouble. We kept coming up with example after example where we wouldn't be able to help a company under this circumstance, and it made no sense to us because, as you know, keeping jobs in the United States, whether they're for Siemens or they're for a totally 100% U.S.-owned company, that's our goal. And so we left a definition of flexibility that deals with U.S. national economic interests. And at times it's possible, although we're reluctant to do that, that we can actually support a company that's really in competition with a U.S. company, but a foreign company that's using more U.S. content than the U.S. company. There's no guarantee when we have a bid and we have a U.S. company versus a French company, heaven forbid, but anyway, that's competing on an equal, transparent basis, and that's even more impossible to have. But that the French company maybe have more U.S. content than the U.S. company that's producing everything in China, and the French company is producing in the United States. So who do we support? It's very hard to go out and advocate on behalf of the French company and against the U.S. company, let's say an HP, in this case Hewlett-Packard, and yet our national interest would dictate probably that that's what we should do because the jobs are in the United States and that's where the benefit will come. But it means that in many cases we kind of hedge our bets, we don't advocate strongly, and we really aren't as effective in commercial diplomacy. I do admire some countries that can pick a winner. But every time a U.S. company has told me over the years they'd like me to pick them as a winner, I'd say, well, what happens if I pick your competitor as a winner from the other U.S. company? So basically, we try to be fair, but at the same time, it can really hamstring us in effective commercial diplomacy on behalf of U.S. commercial interests.
Let me just say, if I may, before Peter takes the last crack at this, this really puts the ambassador in an extremely awkward and difficult and politically sensitive position. I think all of us have been subject to, and some more than others, some really have virtually lost their jobs over this, where a U.S. company who feels that the ambassador has tilted too much to their competitor, let alone a foreign company, will go to the Congress and generate an effort against the ambassador when the ambassador is really making his or her best effort to advance U.S. interests. And so Congress also needs to be sensitized to these interests as well. Peter?
The only thing I'd say in closing on this is that when we were seeking to try and be able to support American jobs, it was differentiating when you had a Siemens to ensure that the support, in fact, came from facilities and activities and factories within the United States. That is an important conditionality and predicate to being able to, in fact, garner U.S. support. The location of incorporation is, in fact, one which is a bright line test, but it's very difficult these days to, in fact, get to actually who the economic beneficial owners are, because so many, of course, are listed on public stock exchanges, and it's very difficult to even try and determine these days where the ultimate economic nexus is. But I think commerce and certainly we wanted to be able to ensure that the support was limited to those facilities and workers in the United States. Having said that, let me do say, Marjorie, that there are in fact American companies who do take active advantage of our competitors' programs. And yeah, right. Point taken. I won't. If you just think of all the major construction or other companies, they use the German, the Italians, the Japanese finance support programs, export support programs, or economic development programs, none of which have the same restrictions as we do. And it leads to a very interesting situation where, by reason of the application of our rules, these companies, American companies, have gone to our foreign competitors to use their finance and export programs. So I think this is a prescription for us to continuing to try and ensure that there's a relationship and nexus between our programs and American workers and taxpayers.
Carl, yes.
Jerry made a very interesting point. Equal, transparent basis. Equal, transparent basis. One of the things ambassadors have to do is involve themselves in the process when there aren't equal, transparent basis. I had a lot of fights in Slovakia where we knew that there were payments being made under the table by the same companies who wanted to have all of the benefits of being a multinational, yet they weren't playing by the rules. And that's a very important role for the ambassador to play, to make clear to the government that we know this is going on and we're very unhappy about it.
Thank you. Question in the back. Please again identify yourself.
I'm Michael Sotiris, former ambassador to Jamaica and Greece, where I had the pleasure of working with Jerry Mitchell. Rather, we teamed up to fight not only the commercial gap that existed between the United States and Greece, although their military purchases were superb during Jerry's and my term, the rest of the trade was meaningfully sorrowful. And we came up with an idea which helped us in public diplomacy, which happened to be commercial diplomacy. We came up with the idea of, since we both traveled the country extensively, to contact and sit down with the chambers of commerce of the country and meet with all the members, 40, 50, 60, 80 firms, sit them down, and provide them with a questionnaire which Jerry developed. Are you interested in selling your product in the United States? Are you interested in adding to your line of goods any product from the United States? Are you interested in partnership with a firm from the United States? And after about 6 months of this work around the country, Jerry developed a volume of approximately 200 to 300 firms that expressed an interest one way or the other on the questions we proposed to them, and provided us also with their financial information as well as other data that we required. This volume, catalog I would call it, was sent to the Department of Commerce of the United States of America for distribution in the various districts of this country. If you heard from them, maybe you did. Neither Jerry or I heard very much about that. But it helped us immeasurably with the public diplomacy side of the problem, because we faced, when we first got there, great anti-Americanism, and by the time we left, that had sort of dissipated. But at least we extended the commercial handshake to the companies, and it was very, very well received around the business community. Jerry, if you, please add whatever you have on that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Jerry, do you want to comment?
No.
That's excellent initiative. Yes.
My name is Robin Duke, and before I had anything to do with the diplomatic world, I was a stockbroker, and then went with a corporation. And the thing that we felt, which we ran into in all our business dealings, was the lack of, I don't know where Carl is, he left the room, but a lack of transparency. Once in Jakarta, for example, we had a milk plant. We couldn't get a telephone, but if we would give a certain person $5,000, we could get our telephone. And our plant was about 40 miles outside of Jakarta. We used bicycles, cars, whatever, and we didn't get this telephone until they were ready to give it to us, because we obviously were abiding by the regulations. I can think of similar situations with other companies. Rockwell is an American company. We sell all our axles to Mercedes. they're in Germany. I mean, and we had many different I was on that board, and so I remember a lot of the negotiations. Our problems have been that, of course, there isn't the transparency there should be. And I would like to ask you to comment on that, but also to say to you, because I'm rather old, I remember in 1959 working in Moscow when Nixon, and I applauded him for this, brought to Moscow coordinating with Khrushchev, a show of what was the American industrial world. And it was very impressive. And I gave him a lot of credit for stimulating an interest. Obviously, in those days, we weren't going to move any mountains in Russia. But I will say that Tommy Thompson, Llewellyn Thompson, our ambassador, could not have been more helpful. And I've never dealt anywhere in the world with embassy people who haven't been helpful on the commercial side. So, and I've always thought of them being reasonably attentive to this. And so you've indicated that we've lagged way behind. But I would like to say that in the experience of being the wife of an ambassador, in almost every country where we served, 4 countries, there was a lot of cooperation between the commercial section and my husband's office. And I remember I can name most of the companies, American companies with facilities abroad, where we had a lot of close connections. So I would like to a plus for some of the embassies.
Thank you, Reverend. First of all, we should all be so old, or look so old. Second, if I may make a brief comment, and then Peter indicated he would like to comment, and I'll certainly open it up to Jerry and Vicki. When I worked in the Carter White House when I was the President's Chief Domestic Advisor, we created with the Congress the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which was very much opposed by the U.S. business community, and with some justification thereafter. The argument was that there was an unfair playing field with companies from other industrialized countries who did not have a similar requirement. And indeed, a number of countries in the EU actually allowed tax deductions for bribes paid to get business, literally. When I was in the State Department, I had some satisfaction in being able, after a 20-year interval, to help level the playing field by negotiating the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, which is now going into effect. But I have to say, even with that, and even with peer review that's being done, this is still a convention that is often honored in the breach by some of our competitors. And so the whole transparency issue is a very important issue. We have an interest, a real commercial interest, I think, in making sure that other countries abide by the same restrictions our companies do. Peter?
What's really important here is the willingness of the United States government to actually put sanctions against those countries who are not, in fact, observing transparency, and when you, in fact, do encounter these practices. I found it very difficult, to be honest with you, when I was chairman, president, CEO of OPEC, to get the rest of the interagency process to go along with me when I wanted to shut down our programs in these countries that were, in fact, engaging in these practices. But notwithstanding the opposition of some of our sister agencies, we did shut down and are shut down in the Dominican Republic today because of their lack of willingness to, in fact, to impose, to observe international commercial arbitration, and have inflicted their domestic courts through bribery. We're closed in the Dominican Republic. We're closed in Gabon because of the same thing. But it's very difficult to get other agents to go along with us. Having said that, the United States has been willing in those instances where there have been significant lack of protection for American investment, to in fact go along with sanctions. OPEC is closed today for the most part in India, believe it or not, because of the double power problem. We were closed in Turkey. We were closed in Nigeria. But you have to be willing to go fight these battles in the interagency process. and you've got to be willing to be strident about it. And there's a lot of pushback, as you might imagine, because certain agents of the United States do their sort of rationale is to be friends with people and not oppose sanctions on these things. But they're important because I'll just close on this. Turkey did, in fact, rectify its problems. India has, in fact, concluded its arbitration with us. Nigeria did, in fact, remove the restrictions. And so there have been remedial effect if you're willing to take sanctions.
I don't want to intrude on the next panel. If there's one last question, I'll take it, and then I'd like to sum up. Yes. It's my friend Whitney Schneidman.
Stu, thank you. My name is Whitney Schneidman, and I had the honor to serve under Stu as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs in the Clinton administration. And in my private capacity, worked very closely with Peter Watson and can attest to his great creativity and leadership at OPIC on behalf of a client of mine. But my question really, I wanted to follow up on the point that was just made by the gentleman here about his catalog, because I think it touches on a critical issue, and that is, how do we get the opportunities? How do we get ambassadors to identify the opportunities, and how do we get those opportunities disseminated back here in the United States to really instill excitement by U.S. businesses to go overseas, but more importantly to capture those opportunities that exist? And I'd just be interested in your thoughts. One last point, Vicki. When I was in government, we worked on an idea in the Africa Bureau that didn't go very far, but I thought it was significant, and that was the notion of trying to get some of our very talented Foreign Service officers to spend 6 months in a major U.S. company attached to the Senior Vice President for Business Development. I still think that has merit for giving some of these Foreign Service officers the hands-on experience that they won't get in their careers, but intuitively understand. So I'd like to get your reaction to that as well.
Thank you, Whitney. We've talked about this over the years off and on, and actually talked about sponsoring a program. There's been a little pushback from the State Department because they were afraid that officers would jump ship, but that was during a different era, and I think the morale at the State Department is certainly very high right now. I think it's a very useful kind of exchange, and BCIU is always open to looking at that kind of a program.
Let me conclude with the following remarks, trying to draw on what the panelists and you in the audience have said. First, that as Jerry indicated, I think very nicely, the three goals on commercial diplomacy are advancing the commercial interests of U.S. companies abroad, encouraging the liberalization of global trade on the theory that this helps not only U.S. companies but economies abroad, which in turn helps the U.S. economy, and the development of the economy of the host country. Second, the issue of coordination is critical. We heard this throughout all the presentations. The difficulty of the ambassador coordinating multiple agencies at post with different reporting channels to the home agencies back in Washington, but also, and perhaps even more difficult, making sure that there's coordination in Washington, which the ambassador obviously has only a limited ability to do. My experience with the Trade Promotion Coordinating Committee, having been at both Commerce, State, and Treasury, is that it is good in theory, but frankly, because it's chaired by Commerce, many of the other agencies send second and third level people to participate in the TPCC, and it's the traditional jealousy. And unless the White House itself insists that TPCC and commercial diplomacy be coordinated better, it's not going to happen. And that means much more emphasis on the National Security Council, the National Economic Council, viewing commercial diplomacy as a critical part of foreign and economic policy, and insisting that agencies in Washington coordinate in the same way the ambassador has to do so at post. Third is the issue of training, which Vicki talked about and which was talked about here. If both the questioner and Vicki agree that foreign service officers are getting less training relative to the overall training that they're getting at the Foreign Service Institute and elsewhere on commercial diplomacy, then we really are off track in a time when the economy of the world is, by definition, increasingly integrated, when commercial diplomacy is such a critical part of foreign policy, even in a post-9/11 world in which security interests are involved. This is a security interest of the United States. If we don't have a strong economy, all the things we want to do in every other field, including security, quasi-security, are not possible. We won't have the resources for them. So Kent, you charged us with having concrete recommendations, and I would hope one of the things that would come out of this panel and perhaps this session would be an insistence that on training, that much more training be done both for ambassadors and by career foreign service officers on the commercial diplomacy side. I would also like to put again a plug in for the hobby horse I started off with, which is that also means greater opportunities for foreign commercial service officers at Commerce to become ambassadors, and greater opportunities for those who take the economic track at state to become ambassadors and not be punished and feel that they're second-class citizens at state because they're in the economic rather than the political track. And last was the point on transparency that has been made very eloquently here, that this is an issue we have to fight as ambassadors and representatives of our country abroad. We have to make sure that U.S. companies are not disadvantaged. We have to be willing to step on toes of host countries if they don't come up to internationally accepted standards. Corruption is, by definition, the greatest enemy to economic development in developing countries. So it's not just the question of leveling the playing field for U.S. companies, it's also helping themselves. Thank you very much. We'll have a very short break and then we'll get to our second panel.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you.
Thank you, Al.
It's good we didn't step on each other's toes too much.
Thanks, Bruce. I'll be here.
Thank
I'll
you.
be here.
Thank you for having us. So nice to see you.
Named after my mother's white group. There's two of us.
Welcome back. I'm glad you're here. I think we'll be coming down there. We will.
Hey Sue, how are you doing? Very well, thank you.
Yes, she's a member of our board. Yeah.
And is a very personal friend.
Yes, she will. Well, she's been so supportive and so certainly.
Hi, Kimberly. This is Paul in Washington. Are you still there?
Thank you. I know. It's nice to see you, Congressman. Thank you very much.
He's retired also.
Thank you. It's a subject dear to my heart.
No, I haven't.
We're gonna.
Hello, Kimberly. This is Paul in Washington. Are you on the line?
First of all,
hi, it's Bob Hormats. I'm on the line.
Bob, hi. This is Paul Grachow in Washington, D.C. I just wanted to check to see if you were still there.
When are we on? How long?
I almost named you, but I didn't.
We're going to be coming back in about 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, well, I'm still on. I'll be holding.
Great. I just wanted to check that. So we are you hearing us okay here in the auditorium?
You want me to do it on a handset, not on the speakerphone, right?
Sure. When you come to your portion, if you could do that on a handset, that's going to help us with the sound in the auditorium.
Good. I got it. How many people are there, roughly?
I think roughly about 60 to 70 people.
Great. Okay, well, I'll be here whenever you want me.
Great. Thank you, Bob. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks.
Okay.
Some of our friends here who are in the corporate world are very interested in this elevated NSC and the NSC. Appropriate. We do have programs with NSC.
That's the wrong level.
But they're not really. It's got to be up there with
And the ambassador has to have standing with all personnel issues relating to OSB.
more than just his confirmation hearings, yeah. We talk about this topic, not this. were your buddies. That was your.
No, that was actually after I served.
Oh, that's right. You were ambassador.
Yes. But anyway, the ambassador has to work with you and the president. And this maybe the vice president is calling a lot of shots at questions today. I think quite a lot.
Not to mention the smear on him and his country. That's
So he gets paid?
because what I didn't touch on here is that
Texas Bank.
public diplomacy and commercial diplomacy are linked. You cannot, right in today's environment, it's been slower in companies that used to bring
and I can't.
commercial value.
I can't discern any particular theme to it either.
Are tainted by what's been going on in American politics. So, you know, where it should have been an interlocking kind of a discipline.
I have as a publisher of the Herald Tribune, International, but some of that tries to press. But if they're trying to denigrate the press, seduce and frighten, which they're doing, you're not going to have a whole lot of credibility.
Or if you're being audited for scandal.
And one of my friends is facing jail.
Yeah. With the Valerie.
If you take a look at that story,
yeah, that's a wild story. That's, I mean, you don't even. And we'll never get to the bottom of the story.
Palestine.
They what?
They're just trying to shut him up. By threatening, by
the economics.
Right?
It backfired.
And guess who's never called by anybody?
I think we're going to have a lot more in terms in the next panel, hopefully.
I know. I just read an article in the Acid Digest. Why was Novak? Why wasn't Novak? Why was it Miller and the other reporter?
I helped put Novak and Rolly Evans together.
Did you really?
What's your focus?
That's not a good story.
No, I'm sorry.
Good luck
Nice
to you.
to see you.
Enjoyed
Thank
your
you.
remarks.
Hello, how are you? You
Nice
did
to
so
see you.
well
Thank you,
in
Diane.
the Q&A.
This is what I read. No, it's just this percentage as an overall taking out. Sometimes they don't really know what they don't know, or do not. It's connecting dots.
Yeah.
You know, enlightening.
many people are. Well, the kitchen is closed, so we'll have to do.
Well, these
these are all clean. So. Nice to meet you. Thank you very much for.
Sorry to have been there. I'm here now. So.
Yes, no, that's all right. We were running a little bit late, so.
Carolyn, someone needs to call us to order.
Yes.
Should we get Bruce or?
Yes.
Or.
Well, Dr. Watson is going to moderate this piece. Let's see if we can get.
So you're based in Iceland? You're serving now as ambassador?
I was then. Yeah, I was undersecretary during the Reagan years, of commerce, and then I was ambassador. And
Brandon, say hello. Okay. Brandon Grove.
Oh yes, hello.
Brandon, your father. We were in Berlin together.
Yes. How was your family? They're great. My parents are both very well. They are
Bruce, why don't you get us going?
Bruce, why don't you get us going? Place in France they go to.
I'm not surprised to hear that. Is your father working at something, or is he enjoying?
He's enjoying and working. He's working. He's involved in UBS. That's his main bank.
Yes.
I wondered if I could all urge you to take your seats, and we'll get started.
Wonderful.
But he also does various charities.
Wonderful. I've just finished a book called Behind Embassy Walls. Talk about him, and I talk about the days it's in Milwaukee, in Berlin. How nice. Would you give them my very best, please? Very fond of him.
Okay.
I enjoy reading your stuff.
Thank you.
Where's Peter? Why don't you get Peter up here and get him going?
Where is Peter? He's being buttonholed outside, I think.
Calling Peter. Maybe we can moderate ourselves.
This is a classic description of the Senate. The majority leaders like herding cats.
I'm not Hormats either, so.
You know how to link Bob in?
Yes, Bob's on the phone right now. He's listening in. So all you have to do is
how do we
just mention it like he is in the room. He is in the room.
Let me get wonder if I could ask you all to take your places. Here comes our moderator, Peter Watson.
I don't know. I think he got sick or he had a hurt back or something.
Just let me reintroduce very briefly Peter Watson in his second role. You see we've drafted him to do double duty today. Peter, as you know, just left his presidency of OPIC, and before that served as chair of the International Trade Commission, of the National Security Council, in charge of Asian affairs, and still is, I believe, a visiting professor at St. Peter's College, Oxford. So it's a very erudite moderator that we have today. Peter, let me turn it over to you and just remind you all that we are very focused on actionable recommendations, just the kind of thing that Stu Eisenstadt, our first panel moderator, was focusing on at the conclusion of his remarks.
Ken, thank you very much. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to ask that our panelists observe no more than 3 to 4 minutes of preliminary introduction. I believe we have Ambassador Hormats on the phone.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We can, and you're looking.
Welcome, Bob.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
You're looking good today.
Thanks.
I think what we'll do, by way, I think, of just proceeding, is to ask you, Bob, to come in on a second. We'll have, if we could, Chuck Cobb set the scene for us. Chuck, of course, is former Undersecretary of Commerce and U.S. Ambassador to Iceland. The point of reference, if you want, or differentiation, if we can even make one between our first and second panels, is really how do you not so much prosecute U.S. commercial interests for and of their own sake in terms of jobs per se and just economic growth within the United States, but how do you use commercial diplomacy as an instrument and as a mechanism to basically implement and to achieve your broader national security and foreign policy goals? These are the really profound issues that we face today. We've got a great panel who can speak to these issues. Sebastian, of course, has just recently published a book, as you might know, on the World Bank, or should we say the former, now president of the World Bank. There's a lot of very interesting questions of how we use commercial diplomacy, Middle Eastern policy, recently the implementation, of course, of the Millennium Challenge Corporation as a mechanism to try and introduce various policies of the United States abroad to achieve economic development and growth. Tsunami relief, Palestine, significant number of these issues that are out there. So without further ado, Chuck, and I just ask you please to open the program.
Yes, Peter. This morning at our board meeting, we talked about where our next tour, where our next visit should be. And I think there was an emerging consensus, Mr. President, that this hemisphere was our highest priority. And I certainly argued that, which I will now argue to the whole group, that with the FTAA bringing together a free trade area for this hemisphere, and with CAFTA right on the goal line, a signed agreement that's now being considered by Congress in the next few weeks, and the schedule is that hopefully there will be approval by Memorial Day, before the summer recess. These issues clearly are beyond trade. They're clearly beyond commercial issues. They are really the first steps of a broader integration in our hemisphere, and hopefully a broader integration similar to what Europe has successfully achieved over the last few years. I have a personal interest in this. I'm the chairman of the effort that hopes that the Secretariat of the Free Trade Area of the Americas, the FTAA, will be headquartered in Miami, and that Miami is already emerging as a Brussels, but with this agreement approved will become the true Brussels of our hemisphere. So it is, but it's only one of many, many agreements which is going to deal with not only trade, not only economics, not only economic development, but dealing with drugs, dealing with terrorism, dealing with all the other foreign policy objectives that we have as a country. And so, and which is really, and maybe just to go off on that just a second, which is one of my frustrations when you try to have a debate with a Lou Dobbs or others that narrow the argument only to trade, when in fact the issue of integration deals with the transparency that you dealt with at the last panel, and you deal with the broader issues that are so important for us in this hemisphere to make us as a hemisphere more competitive, more democratic, and all the things that we want for the hemisphere. I'd like to, if I could, Peter, in addition, deal with just a couple issues that came up in the first panel that I have a slight difference of opinion on. I think the first panel concluded that we're making backwards progress in the State Department in terms of focus on commercial diplomacy. And my judgment is different than that, materially different than that. Having been in the Commerce Department as an assistant secretary and undersecretary during the Reagan years, and then an ambassador during the Bush one, I had an observation that we as a country were doing a poor job in a lot of our embassies, and that our ambassadors, and particularly our career ambassadors, were doing a poor job in commercial diplomacy. So I had a discussion with Brandon, I think you, and Secretary Eagleberger, who I think was deputy at the time, about this issue. And so I was encouraged, along with my wife, to fund a $10,000 award each year that goes to the career ambassador in our embassies and a non-careerist. And so, and the support we've got from that through first Bush 1, and then through the 8 years of the Clinton administration, and now 4 years of George W. Bush's administration, the commitment we've had from across the board from the State Department, from each of the secretaries, but particularly the undersecretaries of Commerce, the undersecretaries of State for Economic Affairs, has been just superb. And the net result is that I think, maybe different than the first panel, I think the culture is changing. And I think, and although we do not have as many ambassadors from the economic cone as we'd like, but we do have 2, and we had just 0 a few years ago. And although we have, commercial officers too, but there is a significant number from the economic cone, and I don't have those statistics, maybe somebody does. But another measure of the success is how many of the, at least the winners of the Cobb Award, are now assistant secretaries or undersecretaries. Nick Burns was one of the winners, is now undersecretary. Dick Boucher, the spokesman, is a former winner, is assistant secretary. John Wolfe just completed an assistant secretary. Mark Grossman and Mrs. Jones, who has just been assistant secretary for Europe. So at least 5 winners have made the assistant secretary in the last 2 or 3 years, which I believe, and I can't prove this, but I believe their commercial advocacy success and their winning of the award was an integral part of their eventual decision of the secretary, the assistant secretary, to make them senior participants in the State Department. So I think commercial advocacy is making progress, particularly with the career ambassadors, and I think this book that, and we didn't really talk too much about the book. Vicki, I was hoping, was going to talk more about commercial diplomacy and the national interest. And so the way I would, Peter, change our description, serving the national security and the foreign policy goals, commercial advocacy is one of those important issues of national interest. And in this book, again, and I commend it to you, terrific stories of the successful commercial ambassadors also were, they didn't subordinate national defense or national security or other issues to commercial diplomacy. They were good across the board, and therefore they were successful ambassadors. I have some other comments, but I'd like to pick up on that. I think I've gone my 4 minutes.
Thank you very much. Obviously the real question that I think we can pose in this panel is, in fact, to what extent commercial diplomacy is an effective mechanism or way of, in fact, achieving national security and foreign policy goals. And it might be, Chuck, that in fact the reason that we've seen some success in those areas is there has been a very clear delineation that the commercial objectives are in fact principle and mechanisms for advancing particular identified and prioritized national security and foreign policy goals, where in the absence of those they're not perhaps getting the same priority. So with that by way of perhaps introduction, let me invite Dr. Hormats. Bob, your full bio is set out here. I would like to be able to say I had as many distinguished services and awards. I think you were served as the Sherpa in pretty much every agency in which you served, and therefore I think uniquely qualified to speak to the intersection of commercial diplomacy, national security, and foreign policy.
Well, thank you very much. First, thanks for inviting me, and second, I'm very sorry I wasn't able to come, but I will try to make up for it with some thoughtful remarks, at least try. I think there are three areas that I'd like to focus on to hone in on examples of where commercial diplomacy has played a particularly important strategic role in response to your question. And I go back initially to the opening to China. And it is little known, but it is a fact that many of the most important signals that were sent to the Chinese early on, and indeed sent to the broader community early on, were commercial and economic. Just to start out with one it's minor, but it took on a significance beyond the numbers. The first signal to the Chinese that we were willing to make a change in our relationship was to allow Americans to import $100 worth of Chinese goods, so long as they didn't come from China but came through Hong Kong in effect. Now this seemed like a little signal, but it required a great deal of coordination between the national security types and the Department of Commerce and the economic apparatus in Washington on the Hill and elsewhere, because it was seen as an important signal. And of course the people who didn't want an opening with China immediately pounced on it as giving in to the Chinese, and the people who did like it said, well, it wasn't enough, it wasn't sufficient. But there were a whole series of major changes in our economic relationship with China that in effect predated a number of the strategic changes in our relationship, and they all required a very delicate kind of commercial diplomacy, which involved Commerce Department, USTR, the economic officials of the State Department, and the Treasury, coordinated by the NSC, but nonetheless everyone had an input, some more than others, but it was an interesting process of linkage there, and a very important one. The second one relates to the broader question of how national security and national political arrangements are related to and interact with economics, and that was the example used a little while ago of the European Union, where with the European Union, if you go back to the coal and steel community, Jean Monnet, a lot of the initial development of the framework that really became the European Common Market and then the EU started out with a great deal of very intricate commercial diplomacy, beneficial to each side because, of course, the French could sell their agricultural products in Germany, and the Germans could sell their manufactured products in France. Simplistic way of looking at it, but there were a number of very significant commercial trade-offs that were made in the interest of this broader set of political relationships. And I think that if we're looking at that as sort of a template, not a 100% accurate one, but nonetheless it has certain similarities between trying to develop a free trade arrangement within the Americas, the FTAA. It has to involve some political understandings as well as some important economic understandings, and therefore I think trying to look at them in the context of how do we strengthen relationships in the hemisphere, you have to see how we can proceed in parallel between the commercial and the political aspects of that relationship. But because there's one thing that's quite clear, and that is trade doesn't stand on its own. It requires a political framework within which to operate, and if it works properly, it can enhance the political framework, and the political framework can in fact advance the trade process. The third area that I think is extremely important in terms of real concrete progress is the Middle East. One of the most successful aspects of our Middle East diplomacy is the qualified investment zones, the quizzes. And they've been very successful in Jordan, to the point so successful that the Egyptians want them and want more of them than we're able to give them, at least for the moment. And I think, and I was at a conference the other day, some of the audience may have been there, sponsored by Aspen, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Peres was there, a number of the senior Palestinian leaders, including the president's son, and Dahlan and others. And one of the things that came out of this was the fact that it's not just good enough to have two independent sovereign states living peacefully side by side, although that obviously is an important achievement. But the other part of it was that they have to be two prosperous states side by side, which requires a great deal of trade between them. You can't have one wealthy Israel and one very poor Palestinian state, and Shimon Peres made this point, and a number of Americans did too. And therefore, I think that one of the roles of commercial diplomacy and indeed economic diplomacy in that region is to find ways of strengthening the economic institutions in the Palestinian territories and indeed in other parts of the Arab world, so that you can have a broadening of economic opportunity and a broadening of participation. And these, I think, are three important areas where you see the links between national security, U.S. political objectives, and U.S. commercial / economic objectives.
Thank
so
you.
Let me stop on that note. I've exceeded my time.
No, on the contrary. Thank you, Bob. That I think you came right within the time frame, and I think very usefully focused on three crucial intersections of national security and commercial diplomacy, which serve to inform us as we think about foreign policy objectives going forward. And in that context, we are very pleased today also to be joined by Sebastian Melleby. Sebastian, for those who do any reading of contemporary literature, is a very thoughtful editorial writer and columnist, most recently with the Washington Post, previously with The Economist. Has published a series of very interesting books, most recently again on the World Bank. And thank you, Sebastian, for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Peter. My main qualification for being here actually is that as a 7-year-old, I moved from Britain to New York, where my father, who was a career British Foreign Service officer, was given a commercial diplomatic role. And he arrived in the early 70s, and he noticed that New Yorkers at the time wore extremely wide-bottomed pants, trousers as we call them, but they unaccountably went about on bicycles without bicycle clips to prevent said pants from being chewed up in the chain disfigured with oil and causing traffic accidents. And so he located a British bicycle company and told them there was a market niche or niche. And very quickly, British bicycle clip exports reached a temporary high until US competitors noticed what was going on and wiped out the British imports. So I say this partly for fun, but also because it inoculates me, I hope, from my real role here, which is to be sort of a skunk at the party. I have some reservations about the theme of commercial diplomacy, whether it's really the right focus, and they are as follows. One thing I think is that although, of course, there can be synergies between political strategic goals on the one hand and commercial ones on the other, there can also be very real trade-offs. I was struck as the Economist correspondent in Japan in the early to mid-1990s, watching the Clinton administration come in and deal with Japan on the theory that the political military side had been overemphasized in relations with the Japanese, that it was time to push harder on trade and harder on sort of the interests of US investors who wanted to get into the Japanese economy. And the story of that episode, I think, is that after trying it for a couple of years or so, when a Japanese schoolgirl was raped in Okinawa by 3 servicemen, military servicemen, the political establishment in Tokyo, which would have normally risen to the defense of the US-Japan defense relationship, did not do so. And the reason, I think, having watched it closely as a correspondent, was that pretty much every headline in the Japanese press for 2 or 3 years having to do with US-Japan relations was essentially about, Miki Kanto arrives, points sort of metaphorical gun at throat of Japan and says, open up your market. And that is not a way to sort of nurture the relationship for when it's going to hit a tough time on the defense or the political side. And so I think there are these trade-offs. It's not always a sort of happy synergy, although those do exist as well, as Bob Hormats was saying, in the context of the early China diplomacy. The second thing I think it's important to keep in mind on this skeptical side is that when US diplomacy is identified with the interests of particular US firms, US corporations, you are on a very slippery ground in terms of public diplomacy. It is the cliche, I would say, of attacks on globalization and the open trading system to say globalization is all about corporate interests. It's all about the corporate-centric view of the world. That's what the US really wants. That's what the World Bank and its surrogates really want. This is all a con to extract more profits. And as a journalist who sort of believes in globalization and tries to make arguments for why it's actually a good thing and lifts people out of poverty and so forth, I hear this critique all the time. And so we ought to be careful, on the assumption that most of the people in this room do believe in open trade, we ought to be careful in giving arguments to people on the other side by linking US policy too explicitly with specific US corporations, or even with specific US industrial interests, when one of the most damaging things I think to happen to the world trading system in the Doha round, in the previous round, so the Uruguay round, was the insertion of these intellectual property protections at the insistence of the pharmaceutical sector, which I think brought into the trade agreement something which hadn't been there before, namely intellectual property protection, which arguably should have been dealt with in a different forum. And it was possible then for critics of trade to tar the whole business of reducing tariffs and eliminating quotas with the brush of, this is just a front to protect the intellectual property of US pharmaceutical and other intellectual property owners. So I don't necessarily buy that charge. I'm just saying this is ammunition which shouldn't be given away too easily to the critics of globalization. So I think it's important basically to separate US diplomacy, and this is my main pitch, away from sort of corporation-specific commercial diplomacy and firmly in the direction of sort of general rule of law, corruption fighting, open trade, where you're setting the rules in a way that any corporation could potentially benefit, be it a Japanese one, a European one, or somebody else's corporation. And sometimes, no doubt, these will be American. And in fact, because American firms are extremely competitive, they will often be American. But this needn't be stated too explicitly. Better to go for the general target. Avoid the pitfall of being, associated with sort of a Halliburton foreign policy. And so I think in this regard, initiatives like the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which set out a sort of set of clear criteria which countries need to pass in order to qualify for MCC assistance, which have to do with economic policy management, policy quality, the political transparency, how many days it takes to set up a business. These are very clearly, as you know, probably demonstrated on the website. There's a scoring system, and if countries make the grade, then they qualify for MCC assistance. If they don't, in theory, they're not going to get the assistance. That's a terrifically transparent and perfectly defensible sort of piece of commercial diplomacy, much easier to defend, I think, than kind of the corporation-specific one. And I would also say that, finally, multilateral routes for doing commercial diplomacy, not least the World Bank, are also a way of inoculating U.S. policy from the charge that it's just about promoting U.S. companies. If the money goes through the IDA in the World Bank, you can't accuse the U.S. of just narrowly looking out for its own corporations. And I think, just to wrap this up, it's important to bear in mind the principle that the public sector should look after the public sector's efficiency. That, in other words, it is these things: fighting corruption, setting the rule of law, a fair and level playing field for corporations. And then it will be up to the private corporations themselves to figure out, if the public sector has done its job and created the right playing field, then the corporations will, on the whole, come in. If it hasn't done its job, no matter how much you play the bicycle clip trick and try and bring in specific corporations, I have some doubt as to the return on the investment of that effort.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. The points raised are extremely important, particularly when they come to the question of how do you, in fact, drive economic welfare gains. For example, let's say in the case of trying to assist poverty alleviation, where those objectives obviously are going to involve such things as risk mitigation for corporations who are going to go into these economies, but for the relationship between public economic policy and trying to incentivize and catalyze corporations going into these countries, you don't necessarily see your public policy gains. So it's a very important distinction. One, it's difficult sometimes to be able to differentiate by reason of the fact that clearly you have to incentivize first movers into markets. But beyond that, you do have the sort of moral hazard, if you want, of being seen to be moving exclusively for national interest as opposed to broader international public welfare gains. So the point's, I think, very well taken. Which brings us to the conclusion of the panel, to Dr. Kent Hughes. Kent, of course, in addition to leading the program here at the Center, has had a distinguished career in practice in both the administration, the executive branch, in Congress, as well as in the NGO community. So, Kent, thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you. The whole panel has gotten me thinking, I must say. Sebastian left me thinking again about how there's often an asymmetry between the U.S. role and that of other countries. We have been, at least since World War II, a leader. We have often global interests. We've often taken the lead in a less self-interested way. That does, however, often have economic and commercial costs. If, for instance, in China we felt for whatever reason we really were going to hold off from the protection of intellectual property, there's a cost imposed on a company and really on the broader U.S. economy. I think in those cases the ambassador will often be asked, or should be asked, to take a look at what those costs are and how, in fact, we might effectively compensate for them with some domestic initiative. Second, I think that more and more the ambassador is going to be called into looking at regional development questions. It's been a bad word until recently to talk about nation building, but we seem to be very much back in that kind of business. Again, take the Middle East as an example. President Bush has talked about the desire, really his goal of having a free trade agreement in the Middle East by 2013. In many cases, those individual agreements that may be stepping stones toward a broader regional agreement or the broader regional agreement itself will involve issues that fall outside the normal purview of trade agreements. It may be the environment, it may be labor rights, which is important to many members of Congress. It may be thinking about trade capacity building, both in the narrow sense of being able to effectively administer the trade agreement and in the broader sense of can you really participate in the global economy. And I think the ambassador is going to be thrust in the role of attempting in country, talking effectively not only with other major aid donors, perhaps with the World Bank, which plays such a central development role, but also perhaps with a number of other ministries in the particular country where you're talking about some sort of environmental remediation, whatever the case may be. I think, too, because we are so much in an age in which global challenges are a reality. We live one plane ride away from any disease or any terrorist or often any criminal syndicate, that the ambassador is going to be thrust into thinking about those elements as well. And finally, I think, let me quote Mark Twain, who talked about the fact that history does not repeat, but it rhymes. And I think you can hear some similar verses very similar to those that we heard in the 1980s when Japan was rising and was such a challenge to the U.S. economy, and perhaps even to some extent an earlier era where the country was, its national security, even more its pride, was shocked by Sputnik. I suspect that the 21st century ambassador is going to be or should be asked to develop a deeper understanding of both the new competition, that is the broadband, online, digital competition, where many services now can be performed anywhere in the world, and second, to have a better idea of how both new and old competitors are strategizing about the future. I think that the established economies, Europe and Japan and even India and China, are thinking about how to become major innovators themselves, and to some extent they're attempting to adapt the American model to their own conditions. I think increasingly we will be a user of foreign technologies, just as we'll continue to be an innovator ourselves, and I think the State Department, which has somewhat downgraded the science and technology function, will have to upgrade that function in the future. And finally, if I'm right about the Sputnik era in the 1980s, you're beginning to see again this growing concern about, for instance, our K-12 education system. Eventually, I suspect this will lead to a kind of global benchmarking system, not only looking at best practices here, but how are they doing in Germany, how are they doing in Japan, Korea, and so forth. And the ambassador may be called upon to facilitate that kind of interchange.
I think that's a very useful introduction to the subject. What we'll do is to have additional and supplemental comments from the panel in relation to questions, so we'll entertain questions at this time. Again, please, if you'd be kind enough to... excuse me. Okay. I thought we were going to... If you're going to do that towards the end, or do you want to do it now?
I think he'll do a little commentary.
Very
now,
good.
And then we'll go to Q&A.
Very good. Then, could you come on up, if you wouldn't mind, please, Alfred. We have Alfred Kingon, of course, former assistant to the President, Secretary of Cabinet of the U.S. To the EU. If you'd be kind enough, Alfred, to give us a short commentary, and then we'll go to the floor. Thank you.
The hour grows late, and I know it. And both Sebastian and Kent got onto topics I want to talk about because they kept me thinking about where are we. I am reminded of my old pal Alvin Toffler's designation of this age as the age of information. We are transforming ourselves out of the industrial age into the age of information, and we're just beginning it. My goodness, Kent talked about it, the rate of technological innovation is growing so rapidly that most of us can't even keep track of it. We can't even begin to conceive of what life for human beings will be like in the next 15 or 20 years. If you really want to think about it, try hard to imagine this, that every repetitive human action, every repetitive human activity can be, in essence, reduced to an algorithm and computerized in principle. Well, where does that leave us for our children or grandchildren? So I'm convinced that what Sebastian said and what Ken said is that foreign policy will become more and more dependent on and a function of economic and commercial activity. If I needed anything to remind me of that, and Bob Hormats might remember that. Are you still there, Robert? I guess he's not.
I'm here.
Okay, a dark, cold winter morning in Norway when it was pitch black outside, near the winter solstice, when George Shultz had convened all the ambassadors who were serving at that time in Oslo, and I was ambassador to the EU then, and I had breakfast with him and a couple of aides, and he was very pensive and very silent. And finally he said, "I just came back from China, and do you want to know what Deng Xiaoping told me? Deng said, I will succeed and Gorbachev will fail because I am liberalizing the economy in China and Gorbachev is trying to democratize politically." Well, folks, here we are 20, 25 years later. Look at China today and look at Russia today. And let me continue on this theme that the colleagues on the panel said. Look where we are with China today. Yes, China is the number 2 economic power in the world. Yes, what happened? For whatever the reasons, and we could spend 4 hours analyzing this, in America today, our consumer, due to pressures on income and employment or whatever, have pushed our manufacturers of goods and services to reduce prices. Well, if you want to have reduced prices for your goods and services, it's perfectly logical for American companies to transfer their producing capacities abroad to China. And it continues. If we transfer our producing capacities abroad to China, our companies are affected, individuals are affected, our labor market is affected, so there's even a demand for a greater reduction in prices, and more goods shift over to China. We're in a sort of self-feeding mechanism in the world today, and our U.S.-China trade deficit, as you all know, has reached astounding grounds. And I'm not a protectionist in any way, sense, or form, and I'm not looking for that. But I am suggesting to you that if we expect the world to continue as it is, U.S. consumers buying en masse, Chinese-produced goods, and we being bailed out by Asian countries buying our treasury bonds, theoretically it's possible to continue forever, but history suggests that it won't. So I think the underpinning of foreign policy is going to be the economic and trade policy. That means that in terms of global business, the ambassador who's sitting out there is going to have to deal with corporations and individuals and companies in whatever country he's in, as Americans come and say, tell me about this country. Tell me what's governing it. Tell me the politics. Tell me the economics. And that's what's going to happen and transform a great deal of our foreign policy and making it a function, if you will, of economic policy. The last panel discussed about level playing field, and the discussion that I think Robin brought up was about bribes and things that took place in various countries. And I do remember that when I served at the EU, and I talked to Stu Eisenstadt before about it. But look where we are today. You want to talk about level playing field? The dollar floats, the pound floats, the euro floats, the yen floats, the Swiss franc floats, the renminbi does not float. There's an unlevel playing field that will have to be addressed. I'll close this very briefly because we are running late. Lee Weil gave a luncheon in New York a week or so ago, and I sat next to a chap who really is an expert on China. And he was saying that in every time he goes over there, they keep saying, Taiwan is part of China, Taiwan is part of China, the U.S. shouldn't do everything about it. And I said to him, is that all they say? Well, they say that at every public meeting and every semi-public meeting. Well, that invited my question, what do they say behind closed doors? Behind closed doors, he said, we can't ruin this economic relationship that we have. Somehow we're going to have to solve the Taiwan problem. So I leave you with this thought that, if anything, the ambassador in his future role will play a bigger and bigger part in economic and commercial policy, and that in turn will become a more important part of our foreign policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alfred. Well, that should get us off to a good start from the floor. So, Could we invite some questions, comments, thoughts? Please.
Peter, you talked a lot, and Al just touched on it, and you all did as well in your presentations, about building a constituency, it seems to me, for commercial diplomacy, and the kind of discussion that the four of you just undertook, and with Bob Hormats as well, both within the administration and in the Congress. And frankly, there isn't a champion, in my view, either at the administration level or in the Congress, for commercial diplomacy, for this kind of a discussion on what is our vision of commercial diplomacy, how does it interweave with foreign policy, or Sebastian suggested, conflict at times with other objectives in foreign policy. So I'd be interested in your suggestions on how we go about building that constituency that benefits both business and anyone interested in advancing our economic interests.
Well, let me invite, if I could, Bob Hormats to speak to that. Bob, your tenure over a whole series of administrations and in the commercial field, diplomatic, political, economic, what do you think about how we build out these constituencies?
Well, I think there in a way is a ready-made constituency, but there's a dilemma here, and that is, if you were representing France, let's say, or Germany, the tendency is for there to be one national champion. In other words, if there's, in the most direct sense, you're selling airplanes or you're selling whatever the product is, there tends to be in these countries one company that is the predominant producer or exporter, and therefore you have a very focused constituency, and you can develop support from that constituency for your efforts. In the United States, it's not quite so easy because in most cases there are a large number of companies that produce and export the same kinds of goods, except in rare exceptions. And that makes it a little bit harder to do because you can't really show preference for one as opposed to another. Once in a while you can, because there might be one in the final deal and you can support them. So in a way, it's a little bit more complicated for Americans than for representatives of other countries. But more broadly, there are an increasing number of very important commercial issues that Al mentioned just a moment ago. There are currency issues. There are issues of opening up countries as a result of their commitments under the WTO, their commitments to enforcing WTO obligations, their commitments that countries have to enforcing obligations under, say, NAFTA. And I do think, in that sense, the more visible the agencies are, the better it is. Now, the problem has been in the past that the State Department, and having worked there, I can attest to this, the State Department has a sense of ambiguity in the way it addresses some of these things. Very frequently, the argument will be, well, there is a violation here. There is an issue that where we should be a lot more assertive, but we have 4 or 5 other issues that we have to deal with respect to this individual country, this particular country, and therefore we really can't push to the maximum. And that has been one reason that the State Department has found it very difficult to get to be seen in the public eye as the chief defender of America's trading or America's overseas economic interests. And I fear that's sort of built in, that's almost endemic, that's almost structural in the way the State Department has functioned. As a result, over a period of time, State Department, beginning in the 70s, when we had these battles with Japan that Sebastian very correctly pointed out, we have found it much more difficult to demonstrate to the American public that the State Department and the commercial attachés that are connected to it, to the extent they are or were, is really the champion of American commercial interests, and therefore it's awfully difficult. Whereas at that point, USTR built up a constituency, Commerce Department built up a constituency, and State was sort of left as a less influential player. And the question is, how do you build it in the future? I think one thing is that the State Department now has a very credible Secretary of State, very, very good people there. Bob Zellick, in particular, understands these issues as well as anyone in the world. And it may well be now that State Department can begin to develop a constituency in this new environment, but it's always going to suffer from the fact that there are other issues that other people, assistant secretaries of the regions, are going to be pressing, and that may be seen to sort of mute the or moderate the zeal of the State Department on these commercial issues.
If we think about constituency building both at the domestic and national level, we also must think about it clearly, coming back to Sebastian's point, in terms of building out a multilateral platform that is acceptable more broadly to the international community, a constituency for particular disciplines and going forward. And Sebastian, I wonder if you might just comment perhaps about how you might have seen or thought about constituencies that were built up throughout the Uruguay round or through the current round, where part of the challenge is to align the interests between obviously not just the US, EU, and Japan, let's say, but the important LDC representatives, Egypt, South Africa, clearly, and others. And if you can share with us some sort of thoughts you might have on multilateral constituency building.
Sure. I mean, there's clearly been a huge expansion in the complication of doing trade deals, for example, precisely because it's no longer enough to have sort of talks between the EU, the US, Canada and Japan, and then you sort of impose it on the rest of the world. That was sort of the going in approach, I think, after the end of the Uruguay round, and it blew up first of all in the Seattle Trade Summit in 1999, which broke down because I think in part of the talk about having labor standards built into the next round, at which the LDC delegates walked out. And it blew up again, sort of, in Cancun in the ministerial meeting a couple of years ago, when again the sort of Brazil-led coalition of sort of Brazil, South Africa, India was flexing its muscles and demanding things and saying that the agenda as developed thus far by the US and the Europeans was simply not acceptable, not generous enough to their interests. And this is, I think, is a sort of permanent shift in the balance of power commercially in the world, reflecting the growth in economic clout of China and so on. And it isn't going to go back, and therefore there is a much more complicated aspect to getting deals done. You have to, and I think Bob Zoellick has been very good at this in the first Bush term as head of USTR, by trying to develop leaders in each developing country bloc. So you identify which couple of trade ministers in Africa have the credibility to speak on behalf of other Africans because of the clout of either their country or the individual stature of the trade minister. And you really cultivate those people, because you cannot talk to 40-something African countries, but you can bring in a couple of leaders from that continent into your deliberations, and then hope that they can then go turn around and sell what you're doing to the rest of the continent. So I think that's part of what has to happen in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sebastian. Thank you, Bob. We have a follow-up question here.
Yeah, I just like
if you'd introduce yourself again,
Oh, right,
please.
Robin Duke again. I'd like to just ask you to comment on something. I may be stepping on toes, but I would like you to comment on the lobbying that's done to our Congress, and it's enormous, from every industry, from individual companies, and how it sometimes deeply affects trade meetings, negotiations with other countries, and it can be a distortion of what is logical, what should happen. Would you speak on that a little bit?
Kent, perhaps if I could, you were on the Hill for a long time, joined the Economic Committee and various other committees. Do you want to take a first crack at that?
Well, let me say that I was 6 feet tall before going through the lobbying experience that you get on the Hill. So there's no question that it's intense and it's effective. And we've seen some recent examples, for instance, in the DR-CAF, the Dominican Republic Central American Free Trade Agreement, where one or two of the countries had a slight increase in their sugar quota, and suddenly there were angry letters from the Congress representing not only the cane sugar interests but the beet sugar interests. It is certainly a reality, and it adds to the need for creative thinking on the part of USTR. If you you saw a different aspect of it in the Trade Act of 2002. If you go back and look at that congressional debate, it will remind you that it was a real perils of Pauline operation, that there were 3 votes in the House. It passed twice by a single vote and once by 2 votes. And in each case, there were a whole host of interests. In this case, there was a great deal of concern by the apparel, what was left of the apparel, and then the textile industry was a critical swing element there. And to make sure that the textile industry gave enough votes to pass the bill, there was an agreement that in fostering future trade agreements, of which CAFTA became one, that there would be a preference for U.S.-made textiles. So it is simply a reality, and I think in part there's a reality because we have relatively little strategy in terms of moving from one sector to another. And perhaps the economics profession, of which I'm also a part, is very guilty that there's the tendency that trade's a good thing, national income is going to rise significantly, and people who inevitably are hurt by trade are going to be compensated. Well, they're not compensated, and that leads to part of the problem. So it's a domestic solution that could help.
Peter, could I?
Well, I was going to invite Chuck. You've been on a number of public boards, and First Amendment rights, I suppose, do exist for corporations to address Congress. What do you say about the role of corporates in the public lawmaking process?
I think it is positive to the extent that it's to the administration, either party. I think it's negative in Congress, and I think that lobbying produces bad bills. It produces bills that are not in the national interest over and over again. But I think it's very productive within the administration. And having sat in many of those meetings, and the process goes something like this. The industry experts come in the middle of the negotiation, and USTR reports on what happened during that day. The industry experts say, our view is this and this and this and this. And a good USTR, and I've dealt with 4 or 5 of them, and clearly Bob Zellick's one of the best, listens to that dialogue, says thank you, and then goes and negotiates what he or she thinks is in the best interest of the country. So I think it's a good process and with the administration, but unfortunately with Congress, it creates bills that aren't in the national interest. That's my view.
What about the sense that if you look at some of the major international trade agreements and the Uruguay round, there have been small margins, but they've been generated by significant involvement by the corporate community, where admittedly there have been trade-offs, but I think you can look at the economic welfare gains and on balance you can see a significant increase in international trade and economic gains. Is there not perhaps a role for industry in trying to shape some of these policies?
Yes, and as I said before, I think it happens, but I think it's a positive role.
Yeah, I would argue that, and first of all, I would agree, and second, I'd make the point that none of these agreements that I'm aware of would have occurred without a lot of industry support. The Round Table or ECAT, or there were a whole group of businesses that got together as early as the Kennedy round to make progress on a whole lot of things that wouldn't have occurred. Now, it's clear individual groups have their own specific sets of interests and push very hard to have those included, and I think it's correct that a USTR will do what's in the interest of the country and not be unduly swayed by individual companies or sectors, but that's not always the case, and frequently they do have to bargain, and they do have to make concessions to, for instance, the textile industry or or the peanut industry, or some of these other industries that receive egregious subsidies in some cases, or benefits. But that's part of the bargaining process, and you really can't divorce trade from politics. And frequently you need to do things for specific groups in order to obtain broader support for legislation that's in the broader national interest. That's part of the way it goes. So it's not true that these are always pristine agreements. I think we can all agree on that. But by and large, if net they didn't serve the national interest, no USTR or no president would sign off on them. But there is a bargaining process, and you do have to face the fact that some groups get things that you might not want them to have because their support's needed for the broader bill.
Thank you. We got a follow-up question?
Just a quick question, following up on what Bob Hormats just said and Chuck Cobb said so well. The dangerous balance of the constructive role or less constructive role of corporations with special interest and their lobbyists. One thing that I don't understand, we have Sebastian here as a member of the Fourth Estate. What in the world in this era when we all agree that globalization and international trade, it will advance not only the national interest of the United States and our national security, but the well-being of the peoples of the world, a lot of people who are not in on this great economic boom. What in the world is CNN and Lou Dobbs doing, not once a week, every night, in a know-nothing, lame-brain way, trashing international trade and free trade agreements? Does anybody have a clue what's going on up in New York? That's for you, Bob.
Well, let's start with Sebastian. I think
let Sebastian handle that.
Have a shot at that
one. Fourth Estate. He and Lou are very.
My view of Lou Dobbs is somewhat more acerbic than yours, even. So I'm not going to take issue with that. I think what we have seen there in the last few years, sort of picking up more generally from your point, is that you have a kind of stalemate going on trade politics. You've got corporations on one side pushing on particular deals which they find to be worth pushing for. On the other side, you've got a mixture of labor lobbyists, protectionist industries, such as those such as Remain, and also sort of environmental groups. And the more that trade gets kind of wrapped up in sort of regulatory things, the investor-state disputes in NAFTA, the environmental sphere, questions of labor standards and so on, the more you bring in more coalitions of interest groups who want to oppose these deals, or at least push for sort of utopian versions of them that can't actually be negotiated effectively. And so the worry is that there's a kind of long-term trend, as the low-hanging fruit of trade liberalization have been picked, that the remaining fruit are very hard to get, and that the kind of the playing field is tipping. And so Kent mentioned these votes on the Trade Promotion Authority. They only went through because particular people were bought off with rather protectionist concessions. So I think this coalition building, actually, we have to sort of think out of the box. And my example here is the Africa Hope, Growth and Opportunity Act, the AGOA, which was renewed. And the reason I think that the trade politics tipped in favor of renewing this thing, which at one point seemed to be going nowhere, was that a coalition of church groups, both sort of all denominations, kind of got behind this thing and lobbied people in Congress quite aggressively. And the clout of church groups in bringing out votes is well known, and I think that tipped it in that particular instance. And so one perhaps has to think more creatively and bringing. I think my sense of the media is that there's more people now saying and writing that if you want to help poor countries, more trade, more globalization is the answer, not less of it. That the debate, which used to be quite dominated by people of the sort of Laurie Wallach public citizen variety, now the equivalent of Laurie Wallach is Bono, who is pro-trade. So I have some optimism that, Lou Dobbs notwithstanding, that bit is going in the right direction.
The point here's well taken, though, Sebastian. I mean, where you did have the major trade agreements, so Uruguay round, you did have significant opportunities to, in fact, balance gains in trade and services, trade in the GATT. It's not clear exactly where the major gains are left. So what you find is you're having a smaller a number of items on the table in which to in fact balance national equities and interests against, and that I think leads to these rather sharp debates because they're rather narrowly focused interests that are remaining. Bob, do you have any final thoughts on this one?
I agree. I think you put it very well. That's the problem. That in the early rounds there were a lot of trade-offs. There were a lot of moving parts. Now you have agriculture being the number one issue on the agenda this time. That's what the emerging economies want, but there are very strong constituencies here against liberalization, as there are in Europe and elsewhere, and yet the emerging economies think this is the critical element. So how do you make these kinds of trade-offs among various sectors when there's one sector that really dominates the show? And if we want to get more on services, which is clearly one of the U.S. objectives, we're going to have to give more on agriculture. But the power of the agricultural lobby is still enormous. You saw the farm bill that was passed a couple of years ago, and the subsidies that were in that. So it is Sebastian's point is there's less room for negotiation at this point within the domestic constituencies, and that I think is the problem, because it's always been the most difficult negotiation for USTR is really the domestic one. Once you've achieved that, it's relatively, I wouldn't say easy to deal with the foreign side, but it's a lot easier. And this is becoming a problem now. The other part of it is the business community has gotten a lot of what it wants internationally, and therefore is it going to be willing to take the tough initiatives and to take the political heat for pressing for new initiatives by the United States? And that is problematic. It certainly did in the Kennedy round and all the other big rounds, but since the business community has got almost all of what it wants, it's not as hungry anymore and is not going to commit as much political capital.
Sebastian, I wonder if you could just comment on this rather paradoxical development when it came to textile quotas. This was a large area of contention by many countries against the United States previously, quite correctly, against the rather limited interest in North Carolina and other places. And yet, and most of those criticisms came from third world countries, African countries in particular. When it came to the end of the quotas, the politics of that shifted, because in fact at that point the major producing competitive advantage was China. How does commercial diplomacy, some of these equities shift rather quickly in time, and how do you address those, do you think, from a policy point of view?
I mean, that's exactly right. I think 10 or 12 years ago, the expectation was that the benefits of textile quota abolition would be spread around the developing world, and you'd see sort of Central America and Africa and various other regions benefit. And now those benefits are being concentrated very strongly in China. And so I suppose this does, put on the table two kinds of question, or almost two sides of one question, which is to what extent do you want to depart from the sort of pure free trade vision of multilateral liberalization, no favors for anybody, totally level global playing field, or to what extent do you want to favor sort of regional, particular regions or particular countries, which either for strategic reasons or kind of reasons of geography you want to be especially nice to. And so in the textile area, you've got the Central Americans on the one hand who have a sort of standing threat out there to increase the emigration flow. And so you might want to do CAFTA to give them a special leg up. You've got Africa, which has the special moral claim of being the poorest of all continents. You might want to give them, and you have given them through AGOA, a special leg up. Then you've got countries like Pakistan, which are kind of viewed as a frontline state in the war on terror, and you might want to give them a special favor. And so you can sort of accumulate cases which seem quite plausible, where you would balance off this pure free trade vision against a more politically driven one of using trade as a commercial tool to reward important regions. And I'm sort of agnostic on that, except to say that clearly I've just given 3 examples of regions that have a plausible claim. I'm sure that the Andean countries would want to be right with those Central Americans if one was to do the Central Americans a favor. And rather quickly you get into a result which is really much more politics than real economic gain, because the country of origin rules which are attached to any of these regional deals are, as you know, very, very onerous. You have to, for the Africans to qualify for special access on textiles, they have to have a whole sort of regulatory regime set up to prove that they aren't just trans-shipping textiles which are really made in China. So you have to have country of origin rules for all the stuff that's produced, complicated stuff about can the fabric be produced outside Africa and then sewn into clothing in Africa? What percentage of the fabric? How do you define kind of local production versus out of Africa production? And you end up, posing a sort of administrative and regulatory task for weak economies which they are ill-equipped to deliver on and which can divert scarce energy from other developmental tasks in those countries. And also you just have this sort of, red tape soup of rules about origin, which is precisely the opposite of the object of the whole free trade idea, which is that you get rid of all this red tape. So I guess in the end of the day, I'm skeptical again about commercial diplomacy in this application of sort of favoring particular regions.
Can I add to what Sebastian said? I think that's a very good point. And the other part of it is the U.S. There's a concern in the Congress, particularly in the House, that the U.S. is doing that now, that there are a lot of these little bilateral agreements which are designed by the administration to create momentum, but they don't look particularly well organized. They don't look like they're part of some strategic plan. And I think it's harder and harder to get support in the Congress unless there's a very compelling reason for making economic commitments that are largely to serve not so much U.S. commercial interests but broader political interests. You perhaps can get away with it in the Middle East for reasons that are quite obvious, but other parts of the world become a stretch. And if you do too many of them, you first of all take a lot of negotiating time, since these do take a long time to complete. And second, you really dilute your influence with the Congress, because it makes it look like you're just doing a grab bag of benefits for other countries without a strategic concept behind it.
Well, we have, I see two additional questions here. I think what we'll do is we'll take those and be able to conclude on time here. Alfred, please go ahead.
This was just a comment, and
right.
I want to pass to another.
No, please, go ahead.
Okay. I want to go back to Tim's point. Is Lou Dobbs insane, and is New York insane?
Two aren't the same.
You want to...
There's a difference between the two.
If you really want to think about it, and you want to see how Lou Dobbs is a moderate, go out and buy Pat Buchanan's book, Where the Right Went Wrong, and read Chapter 6, where he is an out-and-out protectionist. And you can go through all the arguments you want, as we do, and I've had a debate about an hour long with Pat on the telephone. And remember, he was a conservative. Or go and read some of Craig Roberts' columns about the dollar. And really, when you cut it away, and you come down to the essence, and let me suggest to you this is going to be much more intensely debated in the next couple of years. What is the role of the United States in the world? Are we, say, the leader, if you will, or part of the leading group of countries as we build an integrated world and a world economy? Or should we be independent? Should we not be dependent upon anybody else for our defense, for our energy, for our various goods, for our manufacturing? And the other side, that is the conservative side, Pat Buchanan's side, goes all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, who, after all, built the economy in this country. And Hamilton's point was we should not be dependent on anyone else. Therefore, we should be protectionist through and through. And people that I knew in the Reagan administration, Craig, for example, Craig Roberts was an assistant secretary of the Treasury with me, has reverted completely and become one of those who says we will be in deep, deep trouble if we are dependent on other nations for our defense, for our economic well-being, etc., etc. This is a much more philosophical debate at its root. It's how do you visualize the United States in the world? And it's going to continue and become much more intense in the next several years.
Thank you. We just follow on there, and perhaps we can each of the panelists have a few minutes to comment to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. Whitney Schneidman, I just want to take issue with Sebastian's characterization of the African Growth and Opportunity Act as it concerns the red tape, because I think it's an important issue that has larger significance. And I think what we've seen with AGOA is when the U.S. lowered its barriers to some 6,500 products, principally apparel, not textile. It's an important distinction. For those countries that have taken advantage of it, about 10 to 12, tens of thousands of new jobs have been created. Hundreds of $millions of new investment has gone into those countries. And I think it's really underscored the nexus between trade and development. And I think Bob Harmatz was very articulate in saying that the trade-off between what the U.S. wants in services and what the developing world wants in agricultural subsidies is a very real issue. And from my point of view, it's not so much low-hanging fruit or fruit way above. It's really a question of political leadership and what are American priorities. Because I think if we're interested in expanding trade and development in the world, leadership will tackle these issues and will deal with the agricultural constituencies here in the United States, much like AGOA took on some of those really tough constituencies, and will work for success.
Sebastian, I don't know if you want to just take that and take the opportunity to commence the conclusion from each of the panelists.
Sure. I mean, just briefly on that point. I mean, obviously, I think that AGOA is a net benefit for Africa, and in fact, I wrote in favor of passing that thing many times. That's not the issue, though. The issue is, where does that stack up relative to a multilateral liberalization? And I'm saying that the multilateral liberalization has the advantage that it would have the benefit of spreading, promoting growth, promoting investment, and so on, whilst not having these rules of origin, which I know for a fact are an administrative headache to get done. Now, on the other hand, for Africa, AGOA is a preference. It gives them a leg up against other regions in the world. And so narrowly for the Africans, AGOA is preferable because if you've been given the tariff-free access on the garments, not the textiles, thank you for the correction, then you don't want everybody else to have that advantage on garments too, because if they do, then they can compete against you rather effectively. So it's just a question of balancing. Do you want to spend more energy doing these deals which are beneficial to certain regions, but then that benefit gets eroded when you do 5 of these deals around the place, because then everybody is getting the same preference. It's not a preference anymore. And at the end point, not only have 5 people got the preferences, but they all have these rules of origin, and then you have a red tape soup, and it's not clear whether your strategic goal of benefiting a particular region has really been served. That's the trade-off as I see it.
Just any other comment on sort of overall in terms of the discussion, Sebastian, that you'd like to frame at all as we close?
Well, I mean, kind of getting away from the trade area into more the sort of export promotion sort of thing. You raised a good point at the beginning when you said, Peter, that there's a trade-off. If you want to, as the public sector, foster the anti-corruption and the level playing field and so on, nonetheless, that fostering of a kind of good policy environment may not work if you don't get some investment, and you do need to reward the early movers. I agree with that. That's obviously where OPIC has a role to play. So I'm not against that. I'm just thinking that if you migrate that policy out of agencies which are specifically supposed to do it, like OPIC, or like MIGO, which is part of the World Bank, which does investment guarantees, and if you migrate that into the State Department, perhaps that's one migration too far.
I think an important distinction there is obviously between development policy and industrial policy applications. Bob, would you like to have your closing comments?
No, I think I pretty well said what I have to say. I think it's been an interesting conversation. I've enjoyed participating. I think I've more or less said the points I want to make.
Thank you for that. I'm going to Chuck Cobb is going to close, and then we're going to have an adjournment, which I think, Kent, since you're sort of co-convening, if I may ask you to wrap your comments into adjournment, if you wouldn't mind doing that.
It'd be my pleasure.
Let me just, perhaps if I may, in terms of trying to integrate some of the points that have been raised here, there are several points that have been obviously identified as to the relative merits of having specific U.S. corporate interests be part of a broader foreign policy or national security, as opposed to just promoting commercial interests. And there obviously lies in dangers, I think, that Sebastian did point out. But however, there are some limited exceptions which should be acknowledged as being fundamentally important in terms of driving international economic policy. And one that immediately comes to mind, and I must credit the Clinton administration here, in pushing forward the Information Technology Agreement. The Information Technology Agreement was, in fact, an agreement concluded at the close of the Uruguay round, which brought to zero 96% of all tariffs. Brought to zero all tariffs on 96% of all information technology products, which is an extraordinary achievement when you think about how the IT community has driven welfare gains and competitiveness right throughout the world. What's interesting about the genesis of the International Trade Agreement, by the way, ITA, of course, are also responsible for cell phones, and their interference, was in fact how it was created. The Information Technology Agreement, in fact, was the result of a small group of U.S. IT companies that then spread their outreach to like-minded companies in Europe, in Japan, who in turn supported it through the APEC into the WTO. The fascinating result is, of course, that you've had these extraordinary economy-wide gains in countries like India and more recently China. But India is very instructive, because if you look at the comments of some Indian public policy makers, they'll tell you that, of course, the greatest thing that's happened in terms of India commercial policy has been the Information Technology Agreement. However, the remarkable paradox here is that the reason that the ITA was so radical was that there was never any Ministry of Information Technology that had to be reformed. There was no budgets. There were no bureaucracies. There were no special interests that, in fact, were there to protect the ITA being passed. And so this is perhaps one of the rare exceptions where you've got an extraordinary initiative that has been supported right across the world and has significant multilateral gains, and that is something that I think we need to be mindful of. Chuck?
Yes, our objective today was to come up with some definitive recommendations to the administration and to Congress on how we can be more effective with our foreign policy apparatus and how we as ambassadors and future ambassadors can be more effective. And I think we came up with a lot of good ideas. Well, one idea that we didn't develop enough that I was hoping we would is the importance of the National Security Directive 38, which, as all of you know, is the instructions the ambassador gets from the president, and which is a sign-off by all other agencies: Commerce, Defense, Treasury, et cetera, et cetera. In my judgment, that document can be a vehicle for a lot of the ideas that we develop today, can be the vehicle for making clear a lot of the lines of communication and making it clear what the president expects the ambassadors to do in their effective role. So that's one of the things that we're going to spend a little bit more time thinking about, how that can be the vehicle to change behavior, change policy, and change instructions. What we plan to do from here is to develop two summaries: a white paper, a 15 to 20 page paper that will be brief enough that we hopefully be read by members of the administration and by leading staffers in Congress and hopefully some of the key members in Congress. There will also be a videotape that you saw in the back of the room that's being produced. So there'll be two vehicles to codify the excellent ideas and directions that we've had. I'd like to again thank Bruce, our new president, for putting this item on the agenda. I'd like to thank Kent and Carolyn who are going to be key in coming up with this white paper, along with Chris. We're looking forward to working with you. So if you have any ideas on what you think this final document should look like, please let some of us know. And we hope it's going to be something that just won't be on shelves. It'll be acted upon by the administration and Congress. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.
Kent Hughes is one of our co-conveners. I wonder if you would be kind enough to bring us to an adjournment, please.
Well, let me just assure you we have been listening all day for those nuggets of good suggestions, actionable items, doable items. Chris, we really didn't introduce you. Would you stand up and just introduce yourself? This is Mr. Rapporteur today.
Chris Sheevy, and actually came up the hill, so found the take on the hill and trade pretty interesting. But we'll be taking a lot of the recommendations in about a week.
And I want to once again welcome you all to the Wilson Center. We hope you'll see you here more often. Thanks very much to Ambassador Gelb and Ambassador Cobb, who, as I said, really not only thought of this idea, but really helped shape today's program. Many thanks to Claudine and Carolyn, who were just terrific to work with. And as a final promise, when we have that white paper and that videotape ready to go, we're going to send copies of both to Lou Dobbs.
Good thought.
Thank you, Bob, for coming in.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Minority view of Lou Dobbs. I think he is doing us an enormous favor. That he speaks 7% of the American public, apprehensions, anxieties. And if we can't answer, thank you.